Tonight, we're diving into the strange and unanswered corners of the wizarding world, the quiet riddles and half-explained mysteries that linger at the edges of Harry Potter's story long after the last page is turned. Settle in, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to work out, and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady voice turning each old question over gently in the dark. If these long, unhurried stories are the ones that finally get you under, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming, night after night, and that is the only thing I will ask of you before we begin. Over the next 20 chapters we will wander, without haste, through one small mystery at a time. Why a trusted man was trusted, what unseen creatures pull the carriages, how a soul can be torn, and many more, each one held up softly to the light and then let go. You do not need to solve any of it. Let each question move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, softly, down towards sleep. There is a question that lingers at the very heart of this story, quiet and patient, waiting through all 7 years like a single candle left burning in a distant window, and it is this simple wondering: why the greatest wizard of the age chose to place his deepest trust in a man so many believed unworthy of it. Severus Snape moved through the halls of Hogwarts, wrapped in black and in suspicion, cold to his students, sharp with the boy who wore his old rival's face. And again the wise and the watchful asked how Albus Dumbledore could be so certain of him. The answer, when at last it came to light, turned out to be older than the war, older even than the school itself in the lives of the two who lived it, and it began not with spells or secrets, but with a green-eyed girl in a gray northern town, long before the castle, before either of them knew the shape their lives would take. Severus was a lonely boy in a place called Cokeworth, watching from the shadow of a hedge a family of ordinary people whose youngest daughter could make flowers open and close in the palm of her hand. Her name was Lily Evans, and she became the first friend he ever had, and the only one he would ever truly keep. He was the one who told her, softly and with wonder, that she was a witch, and through those long childhood summers, the two of them dreamed together of the school that would carry them away from the grayness of the mills and the smoke. When at last the letters arrived and the train took them north, it seemed to him that everything he wanted in the world was already gathered into that one friendship, and for a while it was enough. Yet the years pulled them slowly in different directions, for the hat sent her to Gryffindor and him to Slytherin, and the House of Green drew him toward friends who whispered of blood and of purity and of the dark arts he found so terribly fascinating. Lily watched him drift and pleaded with him to turn back, and still he followed the crowd that flattered him, until one bright afternoon by the lake, humiliated and cornered, he turned his cruelty upon the very person who had come to defend him, and he called her by the ugliest word his world knew, the word that meant her birth made her lesser. In that single moment, the friendship of their childhood cracked and could not be mended. And though he waited outside the portrait of her tower through a whole long night, begging to be forgiven, she had at last seen the road he was choosing, and she let him go. So he walked the road, all the way to its bitter end, and became a servant of the Dark Lord, a marked man among the Death Eaters. It was in that service that fate handed him the cruelest instrument of his life. For one stormy evening at the inn called the Hog's Head, he pressed his ear to a door and caught the ragged opening of a prophecy. A handful of words about a child born as the 7th month died, a child with the power to undo his master. He carried those broken words to Voldemort like a prize, never dreaming what they would summon, and only later, In a rush of horror, did he understand that the prophecy pointed toward the son of Lily Evans, toward the one person on the earth he still loved above all others? Then came the night that unmade him, high on a windswept hilltop, where he had begged the Dark Lord for nothing, and had been refused. He went to Dumbledore, the only wizard Voldemort had ever feared, and there in the cold and the dark he pleaded for the woman's life. The old headmaster looked upon him with disgust, for the boy at his side seemed willing to let a husband and a small child perish so long as the mother was spared, and he asked what Severus would give in return for such protection. The answer that came back was a single trembling word that meant everything he had, everything he was. And by that word, the two of them were bound together for the rest of their days. Dumbledore promised to hide the family, and Severus turned his coat and became a spy against the master he had served, walking every hour thereafter along the thinnest edge between two deaths. But the charm that hid them was betrayed from within, and on the last night of October, the little house in Godric's Hollow was broken open, and Lily gave her life shielding her son. When the news reached him, Severus went to that place of ruin and gathered her body into his arms, and something in him closed forever like a door against the winter. Upon the same hilltop, later, he wished aloud that he too had died, and it was Dumbledore who lifted his eyes toward a purpose, reminding him that the boy still lived, that her son carried her eyes and her blood and needed guarding. And so a new vow was made, quieter than the first, that Severus would watch over Harry Potter through all the years to come, in secret, so that no living soul might ever guess the tenderness beneath the sneer. He asked that this be kept hidden, most of all from the boy himself, and the old man gave his word. The proof of that promise took a shape so gentle it could break a heart. Years afterward, in the headmaster's study, when Dumbledore gently wondered whether after all this time Severus had perhaps grown to care for the child he protected, the reply was not spoken, but conjured, for from the tip of his wand there rose a creature of pure silver light, a doe, slender and luminous, that leapt once about the room and vanished into the dark. It was the very same doe that had once been Lily's own guardian shape, the same Patronus, born of the same undying love, and the word that accompanied it was the word always, meaning that he had never stopped and never would. In that instant, the old wizard understood beyond any doubt where the man's loyalty lay, not with masters or causes or houses, but with a memory of green eyes that neither death nor time had dimmed. From that certainty flowed all the trust that so puzzled the world. It was Snape who murmured the counter-curse, while a young broomstick bucked and twisted in the air. It was Snape who slipped through the ranks of the Death Eaters, gathering their secrets and carrying them back through the dark. A double agent whose every breath was a wager against discovery. And when the ancient headmaster lay dying at last, his hand blackened and cursed by a ring he should never have touched, it was to Snape that he turned for the final and heaviest mercy of all, asking to be granted a swift and painless end rather than a slow one, so that a frightened boy might be spared the ruin of murder, and so that the spy might keep his precious place among the enemy. The killing that looked to all the world like the blackest betrayal was in truth the last act of an unbearable trust, given and received between two men who alone knew what it cost. None of this was known while the two who carried it still lived, and that was the whole tragedy of it, for the secret was so complete that even the boy he shielded despised him to the end. Only in the last moments of Snape's own life, as the silver strands of his memories drifted from him like breath on cold air, were those memories gathered and gazed upon in a stone basin. And there at last the truth stood revealed in all its quiet, aching fullness. Dumbledore had trusted him, not out of blindness and not out of pity, but because he had seen, plainly and completely, a love strong enough to turn a lifetime of grief into a lifetime of guarding. And that, in the end, was reason enough. Up next in Chapter 2, The Mystery of Ariana Dumbledore, we'll drift softly back to a small house in Godric's Hollow, to a golden-haired girl whose name the wizarding world almost forgot, and to the quiet sorrow that shaped the wisest wizard of them all. And so the trust that Albus Dumbledore placed in the men and women around him, that quiet, patient trust we turned over so gently a moment ago, did not come to him easily, and it did not come to him young. It was learned slowly, and it was learned through sorrow, and the deepest root of that sorrow reaches back long before Hogwarts, back before the war with Grindelwald, back to a small house and a small family and a little girl whose name is spoken only softly in the wizarding world. Her name was Ariana Dumbledore, and to understand the great and secretive man Albus became, one must first sit for a while, unhurried, with the sister he lost. So let your breathing slow, and let the years fall away, and let the story drift back to a quiet village and a childhood that was gentler at its beginning than at its end. Ariana was the youngest of 3 children born to Percival and Kendra Dumbledore, the little sister of Albus and of Aberforth. In her earliest years, the family lived in a place called Mold on the Wold, and there, in the ordinary way of magical children, small, strange wonders began to stir around her, without her ever meaning to summon them. She was 6 years old, no more, when the thing happened that would shape and shadow the whole of her short life. 3 Muggle boys, passing near the hedge of the garden, caught sight of her doing magic she could not yet name or govern, and what they saw frightened them and thrilled them in the cruel way that fear can, and they set upon her. What exactly they did was never fully told, and it does not need to be dwelt upon here in the dark, only understood in its result. For something inside the little girl was broken that day, some tender inner mechanism that lets a witch or wizard hold their power and let it out gently, breath by breath. After that morning, Ariana was never wholly well again. Her magic did not leave her, for it could not, but it turned inward and grew strange and unsteady within her. She became frightened of her own gift, and she tried, without ever choosing it, to press it down and keep it hidden, and magic pressed down in that way does not simply vanish. It coils, and it darkens, and it waits, and now and then it would rise in her without warning, in sudden dangerous bursts she could neither summon nor stop. In the years that followed, those who came to understand such things, including the man who wrote of these matters long afterward, saw in Ariana the mark of what is called an obscurial, a magical child whose suppressed and tormented power festers into a force that turns at last against the very body that holds it. She was, in the truest and saddest sense, a girl at war with the gift she had been given. Her father did not respond to what the 3 boys had done with patience or with forgiveness. Percival Dumbledore went out and hunted them down and took a terrible revenge upon them, and for that he was seized and sent to the wizard prison of Azkaban, and there, in the cold, he eventually died. And here already the quiet riddles of Ariana begin to gather, for Percival never once explained himself, never told the court or the world why he had done such a thing. He carried the reason with him into that dark place and kept it. And he kept it for love, because to speak of Ariana openly, to describe her broken and volatile magic before the ministry, would very likely have meant her being taken away to St. Mungo's Hospital and shut up there for the rest of her days. And so the wizarding world was left to assume the simplest and ugliest thing, that Percival was merely a hater of muggles who had struck out in blind malice, and that shameful rumor settled over the family like a low gray cloud and lingered there for a long time, coloring, in ways he would only later understand, the very earliest thoughts of his brilliant elder son. To hide Ariana and to guard her, Kendra moved what remained of the family to the small and half-magical village of Godric's Hollow, and there the girl was kept close and quiet within the house, seldom seen, gently tended, her presence known to the neighbors only as a vague and sorrowful hush. Of the two brothers it was Aberforth, the plainer and rougher one, who loved her most simply and reached her most easily, for he had a steadying way with wounded and gentle creatures, and Ariana was calmest in his company. Albus, meanwhile, was away much of the time being celebrated as the cleverest young wizard of his age, and he did not yet carry the daily weight of her care. And then, the second great sorrow came, for one of Ariana's sudden uncontrollable outbursts of magic, striking out blindly as such things do, killed their mother Kendra when Ariana was 14 years old. In a single stroke the family lost its keeper, and Albus, still young himself, came home to become the head of the household and the guardian of a sister he loved, but did not fully know how to soothe. It was into this grieving, shuttered house that a bright and dangerous friendship arrived, for in Godric's Hollow there also came to stay a gifted and charming young man named Gellert Grindelwald, the great-nephew of the historian Bathilda Bagshot. Albus and Gellert found in each other a mirror of ambition and brilliance, and together they dreamed great and terrible dreams of a new order in which wizards would rule for what they called the greater good. And in the fever of that dreaming, Ariana became, to Albus in his worst and most private thoughts, an obstacle, a fragile burden that might be carried along behind their grand designs. Aberforth would not have it. He confronted the two of them and told them plainly that his sister was too frail to be dragged across the world in the wake of their schemes, and the quarrel broke open into a duel. 3 wands raised at once in that small house, Albus and Aberforth and Grindelwald turning their anger loose within 4 close walls where a frightened girl stood near. And that is the heart of the riddle, the soft, unanswerable question that hangs over Ariana Dumbledore forever. In the wild crossfire of that 3-way duel, a spell struck her, and she fell, and she died, and no one living ever knew, or could ever know, whose wand had cast the curse that killed her. It might have been Grindelwald, it might have been Aberforth, it might have been Albus himself. The 3 spells had flown too fast and too tangled for any of them to say, and so Albus was left to carry, for the rest of his long life, the possibility that his own hand had ended his sister. Grindelwald fled the country that same day and did not return for many years. At the little funeral, in his grief and his fury, Aberforth struck Albus and broke his nose. And the 2 brothers were estranged for a very long time afterward. And Albus, haunted, humbled, and afraid of what his own hunger for power had helped to bring about, turned away from grand ambition altogether, refusing again and again through the years the highest offices the wizarding world would offer him, choosing instead the smaller, safer station of a teacher. So the little girl kept hidden in a quiet house became, without ever meaning to, the shaping wound at the center of the greatest wizard of the age, and her gentle face still watched over the story from a portrait above the hog's head, patient and forgiving, guarding a secret passage of its own. Whose spell it truly was, no one will ever tell you, and perhaps it is kinder that way, a question laid down softly in the dark, and never forced to an answer. Up next, in Chapter 3, Thestrals, and Who Can See Them, we'll drift toward the pale, winged horses that draw the castle carriages, unseen by nearly everyone, visible only to those who have watched death arrive. And we will ask, gently, what it truly means to be able to see them. And so, from the quiet grief that gathered around one small family, from a childhood cut short and a loss that never fully healed, the story turns tonight toward a shadow of a different kind, one that most people go their whole lives without ever seeing. For grief, it seems, changes what the eyes are able to hold. Those who have stood close to death, close enough to watch it happen, close enough to feel the exact moment the world goes still, carry that seeing with them ever after, and it opens a quiet door in them that never again quite closes. Behind that door wait the Thestrals. They are horses, in the way that a shadow is a shape. Their bodies are black and skeletal, drawn so thin that every rib and every long bone shows beneath a coat that clings to them like something wet. Their faces are reptilian, almost dragonish, without the soft muzzle of an ordinary horse, and their eyes are white and blank and faintly gleaming, wide and pupil-less, and strangely gentle. From their shoulders unfold great leathery wings, ribbed like a bat's, broad enough to fold a grown rider into darkness. To the few who can see them, they look like creatures conjured out of a long, cold dream. And yet, for all of that, they are patient. They are gentle. They are among the most loyal beings in all the wizarding world, and almost no one ever knows that they are there. For years, the students of Hogwarts climbed down from the Hogwarts Express at the little station of Hogsmeade and found the black carriages waiting for them in the dusk. And for years those carriages seemed simply to pull themselves. Harry Potter rode in them again and again, up the long dark road to the castle, and saw only empty harness and empty air between the shafts, and thought nothing of it, because everyone around him saw the same nothing. This is the first strangeness of the Thestrals, and the softest. They had always been there. They had always done the pulling. It was only that most eyes slid straight through them, the way a hand passes through mist, and left them unseen. The reason lies in a single, sorrowful rule. A Thestral can be seen only by a person who has witnessed death, who has watched a living thing pass out of the world with their own eyes. That alone is the price of the sight, and it cannot be paid any other way. It cannot be borrowed or taught or wished into being. It is given only by loss, and once it is given, it is never taken back. This is why the herd remained invisible to Harry for so long. He had, in truth, been present at a death, for he had been in the room when his mother fell, when the green light came for her and did not come for him. But he had been little more than a year old, too young to hold the memory, too young to understand what he had seen. The sight requires not only the eyes, but the understanding, and the understanding had not been there. It came to him at last on a warm June night at the end of his 4th year, in the 3rd task of the Triwizard Tournament, when a boy named Cedric Diggory fell to the ground in a graveyard and did not rise again. Harry watched it happen. He was close enough to see the light leave, close enough to hold what remained. And here lies a gentle riddle that has puzzled many a careful reader. For when Harry rode the carriages home only days later, he still saw nothing pulling them. The answer, it seems, is that such things need time to settle. Death must not only be seen, but absorbed, must sink down through the shock and the numbness into the quiet place where a person truly knows a thing to be real. By the time the new school year began, and Harry stepped off the train once more into the September dark, the sinking had finished its slow work. And there they stood at last, the black-winged horses, patient in their harness, waiting as they had always waited. He was not alone in the seeing. Luna Lovegood could see them too, and she was the one who told him, in her soft and unbothered way, that the creatures were real and that he was not losing his mind. Luna had lost her mother when she was 9 years old, a witch who loved to experiment, whose own spell had gone wrong before the child's eyes. So Luna had carried the sight for years already, and wore it lightly, the way she wore everything, as though the strange and the sorrowful were simply part of the ordinary weather of the world. Neville Longbottom, too, could see them, for he had been beside a member of his own family at the very end, and a quiet Slytherin boy, whose name Harry never learned, could see them as well. When Rubeus Hagrid brought the herd into a Care of Magical Creatures lesson that year, and asked who among the students could make them out, only those few raised their hands, and the rest of the class stared at what looked to them like empty grass. That herd was Hagrid's own, and it was a rare and precious thing, for it was the only tame herd of Thestrals in all of Britain. He had raised them and cared for them deep in the Forbidden Forest, and he was proud of them in the wholehearted way he loved all the creatures that others feared. And feared they were. Because only the grieving could see them, the wizarding world had long counted the Thestrals as unlucky, as omens of misfortune and coming sorrow, as beasts of ill fortune to be avoided and left unspoken of. It was an unfair reputation, born of a simple confusion, the mistaking of the messenger for the message. The Thestrals did not bring death. They only became visible to those whom death had already touched. In truth, they were creatures of great gentleness and great use. They fed on raw meat, drawn from far off by the scent of blood, and Hagrid would carry sides of it into the trees to keep them content. They had an uncanny sense of direction, so sure that a rider had only to think clearly of a destination, or name it under their breath, and the Thestral would carry them there unerringly through the night sky, over any distance, without hesitation and without a map. On one dark evening in Harry's 5th year, 6 young people fled the castle on their backs to reach the Ministry of Magic in London, and though only 3 of them could see the mounts they climbed upon, the others trusted, and swung themselves up onto what felt to them like empty air, and the Thestrals bore them all safely and swiftly to the place they most needed to be. There is one last quiet thread worth following into sleep, for it binds the Thestrals to a deeper part of the story than most ever notice. The tail hair of a Thestral is a rare and powerful thing, tricky and temperamental, and it can be used at the heart of a wand as its living core. Few wand makers dare to work with it, for it is said that only a witch or wizard who has faced death, who has looked upon it and accepted it without flinching, can ever truly master such a wand. And there is one wand in all the world whose core is a single hair from a Thestral's tail, the most famous and most fearsome wand ever made. The one wizards whisper of as the Death Stick, the Elder Wand. A wand pulled from the same threshold as the horses themselves, mastered only by those who have made their peace with the dark. So let the black horses fade gently back into the trees now, unfeared and unhurried, patient in the September dark, pulling their carriages up the long road toward the warm and waiting castle. They were never omens. They were only the truth of loss, made visible to those who had learned to look. Up next in Chapter 4, The Deathly Hallows, Fairy Tale or True History, we'll follow 3 brothers down a lonely road at twilight and ask, softly and without hurry, whether the oldest bedtime story in the wizarding world was only ever a story at all. The carriages that carried the students up to the castle had their patient invisible horses, and only those who had truly looked upon death could see them at all. And so the last soft thought of the Thestrals leads, almost of its own accord, toward another old story about death. A story told not around the cradles of the living, but beside low fires on winter nights. One that the wizarding world has passed from mouth to mouth for many centuries, without ever quite deciding whether it was invented or remembered. It is the tale of the three brothers, and it lies at the very heart of one of the strangest riddles in all of Harry's world. For no one has ever been able to say with real certainty whether it is a gentle fairy tale meant only to teach humility before the grave, or a true account of the gray morning when three men met death upon a lonely road and walked away carrying his gifts. The tale itself is quiet and old, and it was written down long ago in a book of children's stories called The Tales of Beedle the Bard, the same worn little volume that Dumbledore left to Hermione in his will, its cover marked with a small strange sign that none of them understood at first. In the story, three brothers were traveling together at twilight along a winding and lonely road, and they came at last to a river too deep to wade across and too swift and treacherous to swim. Being wizards and being clever, they only lifted their wands and conjured a bridge of stone over the dark water. Yet halfway across that bridge a hooded figure rose to meet them, and it was Death himself, cheated of the three travelers the cold river had been meant to take. And, being cunning, he hid his anger and pretended instead to congratulate them, and he offered each brother a prize for having been so wise as to escape him. The eldest brother, who was proud and hungry for power, asked for a wand more powerful than any in existence, a wand that must always win for its master. And Death broke a branch from an elder tree standing on the bank and fashioned it and gave it over. The second brother, who was arrogant in a colder way, wished to humble Death still further, and he asked for the power to call others back from beyond the grave, and Death picked up a smooth stone from the riverbed and handed it to him, telling him it could recall the dead. And the third and youngest brother, who was the humblest and also the wisest, did not trust Death at all, and so he asked for something that would let him leave that place without being followed, and Death, most unwillingly, drew off his own cloak of invisibility and surrendered it. Then the three brothers parted, each going his separate way with his separate gift, and the tale followed each of them down the road toward what his choice had earned him. The eldest went on to a distant village, and there, drunk on the power of the unbeatable wand, he boasted of it in a tavern, and that same night a rival crept into his room while he slept, slit his throat, and carried the wand away, and so Death took the first brother for his own. The second brother went home alone, and there he turned the stone over 3 times in his hand, and the girl he had once hoped to marry, who had died before their wedding, appeared before him. Yet she was cold and silent and sorrowful, held back from him as though by a thin veil, belonging truly to another world, and in his grief and longing to join her fully, he took his own life, and so Death took the second brother as well. But the third brother Death could never find, for the youngest wrapped himself in the cloak and lived on quietly for many long years, and only when he had grown very old did he take the cloak off at last, hand it down to his own son, and greet Death not as a hunted man greets his hunter, but as an old friend. And the two of them departed together as equals, willingly into whatever lies beyond. For most who heard it, the story was exactly what it seemed, a fable, a soft warning that pride and grief and the wish to cheat Death lead only back to death, and that the wisest thing a person can do is to accept the end when it comes and meet it without fear. Hermione, careful and clear-headed, believed just that the three objects were symbols standing for three human failings, and that no wand and no stone and no cloak had ever truly changed hands beside a real river. Yet others in the wizarding world held that the tale hid a literal truth, that the three gifts were real things still hidden somewhere in the world, and that whoever gathered all three and held them together would become what the old stories called the Master of Death. Those three objects together carried a single name, the Deathly Hallows, and a single sign to mark them. A straight, vertical line for the unbeatable wand, drawn inside a circle for the stone that recalls the dead, both enclosed within a triangle for the sheltering cloak. The very sign that had puzzled Harry when he first saw it, inked in the margin of Hermione's book and hanging at bill end. Fleur's wedding about the neck of Xenophilius Lovegood. What makes the riddle so strange is how much of the tale refuses to stay safely inside a storybook. Dumbledore himself, patient scholar that he was, came to believe that the three brothers had been no invention, but real men. The three Peverell brothers, Antioch and Cadmus, and Ignatus, who had lived long ago, and who had most likely been not gifted these objects by death at all, but had crafted or discovered three unusually powerful things themselves, so that the legend grew up around them the way legends do. And the trail of those objects can be followed, faintly, all down the centuries. A wand that always won for its owner passed from hand to hand through wizarding history, called the Elder Wand and the Death Stick and the Wand of Destiny, leaving a long red thread of murders and thefts behind it, from Emmerich the Evil to Godelot to Barnabas Deverell and Loxias and onward, always changing masters through conquest and blood. A cloak of true and lasting invisibility, one that never wore thin and never failed, came down quietly through the descendants of the youngest Peverell brother, generation after generation, until it reached a boy named Harry, wrapped in the very cloak the tale said Death himself once wore. And a plain black stone set in a heavy ring, marked with the Peverell sign, sat for long years in the possession of the Gaunt family, descendants of the middle brother, until it too found its way into the story of Harry's life. So the question at the center of this chapter never fully closes, and perhaps that is why it soothes rather than troubles. Was the tale of the three brothers only a bedtime story after all, a moral dressed in the shape of a river and a road? Or was it the last worn echo of something that had genuinely happened? Three real objects, and three real brothers whose choices had been softened over the centuries into a lesson for children. Even Dumbledore, who had chased the Hallows in his own reckless youth and been burned by the wanting of them, could never quite say, and Harry, who would one day hold all three, would come to feel that the truest wisdom in the whole legend lay with the youngest brother, who greeted the end without fear. For now it is enough to let the three gifts rest, the wand and the stone and the cloak, each carrying its own quiet warning, each pointing back toward the same gentle door that waits at the end of every long life. Up next in Chapter 5, How No One Saw the Dark Lord Return. We'll turn softly from the legend of a hidden master of death to the far colder mystery of a very real dark wizard who came creeping back into the world while almost no one was willing to believe their eyes. And so, having wandered through a tale that turned out to hold more truth than any child could have guessed, the story of three brothers and the gifts that death was said to have given them, the mind drifts now toward a quieter, stranger puzzle, one that runs the other way entirely. for the last riddle asked how an old fairy tale might secretly be true. This one asks something almost opposite, and just as gentle to turn over in the dark. It asks how something that was wholly and terribly true could go unseen and unbelieved for the better part of a whole year. Of all the mysteries that hang softly over that hidden world, few are as quietly astonishing as this. A Dark Lord rose again. He stood once more upon the earth, with breath in his lungs and a wand held ready in a thin, pale hand. And for month after month, hardly a soul in all of Britain would admit that he had returned at all. It began on a warm June night, in an old and overgrown graveyard beside the village of Little Hangleton, where a stone angel kept watch over crooked rows of the dead. There, in the small hours, a dreadful and patient magic was worked. A bone was taken, without its knowing, from the grave of the father Tom Riddle had never loved. Flesh was given, willingly if fearfully, by the trembling servant who had spent years hiding as a small gray rat. And blood was taken, by force, from the one enemy whose protection Voldemort most wished to steal, the boy who had survived him once already. From those three things, mixed in a great dark cauldron over rising flame, the withered creature that Voldemort had become was lifted back into a body of his own, tall and terrible, and white as bone, with narrow crimson eyes and slits for a nose. On that same night, a gentle boy named Cedric Diggory, who had done nothing at all to deserve it, was struck down with a careless green flash, cast aside as though he were of no more account than a shadow. And the one witness who mattered, Harry Potter, escaped by the barest chance, seizing the Triwizard Cup that was still a portkey, and returning to Hogwarts, clutching the fallen boy in his arms, so that at least the truth might be carried home. Here is where the strangeness truly begins, for the truth was carried home, plainly and at once. Harry told it to Albus Dumbledore that very night, and Dumbledore believed him without a flicker of doubt, and set the old Order of the Phoenix quietly stirring back to life. The confession of the disguised servant, Barty Crouch the Younger, was drawn out under truth potion and heard by trustworthy ears. There was no shortage of evidence, no gap in the tale. And yet the Minister for Magic himself, Cornelius Fudge, stood in that same castle and would not let the words settle in his mind. Fear did what fear so often does. It reached for the softest possible story and held on. Fudge had grown comfortable in 13 long years of peace, and the thought of the Dark Lord returned was simply too heavy a thing to lift. So he let a Dementor be brought close to the one prisoner who could have confirmed everything, and in a single cold instant that witness was given the Dementor's kiss, his soul drawn out, his testimony gone forever. And Fudge told himself, as frightened men will, that the boy was mistaken, or unwell, or seeking attention, and that the old headmaster was reaching too far for power. In this way, the door was quietly closed on a truth that had walked right up to it and knocked. What followed, across that long 5th year, was less a war than a strange and stifling silence. The ministry did not merely doubt the return. It set out to bury the very idea of it. The Daily Prophet, that most widely read of newspapers, began a slow and steady campaign, painting Harry as a troubled boy given to wild stories, and Dumbledore as an aging man losing his grip, gathering followers for some private ambition of his own. Dumbledore was stripped of his seat as chief warlock of the Wizengamot, removed from the great International Confederation of Wizards, and spoken of in whispers as a fool or a schemer. And to the school itself the ministry sent one of its own, a soft and smiling woman named Dolores Umbridge, all dressed in pink, whose gentleness hid something hard as iron. She came first as a teacher, then as High Inquisitor, then at last as headmistress, and under her rule the students were forbidden even to lift their wands in the practice of defense. For the ministry had convinced itself of a smaller, more comforting fear. It believed that Dumbledore was training children as soldiers to seize the government, and so it kept them from learning the very skills that might one day save their lives. Decree was piled gently upon decree, and the castle grew quiet and watchful, and the truth was pressed down beneath 100 small rules. Yet the deepest part of this mystery is not the ministry's blindness at all. It is that the blindness suited two masters at once. For while the government longed for the return to be false, the Dark Lord himself longed for it to remain unseen, and their two wishes, born of opposite hearts, folded together into a single long silence. Voldemort did not want to be known. He had learned patience in his years as less than a ghost, and he understood that if the wizarding world knew he had come back, the frightened and the brave alike would rally against him before he was ready. So he chose the shadows on purpose. He gathered his scattered followers in secret, freed the most faithful of them from the fortress of Azkaban by quiet arrangement, and turned his cold attention toward a single hidden prize. Deep beneath London, in the Department of Mysteries, there lay a small glass orb that held the record of a prophecy, the very words that bound his fate to Harry's, and he wanted them whole and certain before he moved. To reach that orb unseen, he needed the world above to keep looking the other way. And so, the murderer and the minister, who agreed on nothing else in all the world, agreed without ever meaning to on this one thing, that the return of Lord Voldemort should stay a secret a little longer. For nearly a year then, two powers pulled in the same strange direction, and the truth hung suspended between them like dust in a shaft of light. Only a small band of the watchful, the reborn Order of the Phoenix, and a handful of students meeting quietly in a hidden room, held to what they knew. Everyone else was left to drift in a comfortable and dangerous calm, believing the peace they wished for, rather than the danger that was real. And the blindness held, and held, until the night it finally could not. For it broke at last in the very heart of the ministry itself, in the great marble atrium, where Voldemort and Dumbledore met in open battle among the fountains and the flying fire. And there, at the last possible moment, Cornelius Fudge arrived with a knot of officials at his side and looked, with his own two eyes, upon the tall white figure he had spent a whole year insisting did not exist. In an instant the Dark Lord was gone again into the dark, but the seeing could not be unseen. By the next morning the newspapers had turned entirely about, and the name that could scarcely be spoken was printed plain for all to read. He who had returned in a lonely graveyard had returned at last in the eyes of the world, and the long soft silence was over. Rest here a moment in that strange truth, that a thing may be wholly real and still go unbelieved, simply because believing it is hard. Let the graveyard and the pink office and the marble hall all fade gently now, as one denial gives way to another kind of question. Up next, in Chapter 6, The Riddle of Wandlore and the Elder Wand. Will? And when at last the whole of that hidden world had failed, quietly and almost completely, to see the Dark Lord climb back into being, there remained a smaller and stranger question, folded softly inside the Great One. A question about the very things that wizards carry in their hands. For all the fear that gathered around Lord Voldemort in those returning years, part of what drove his hunger, and part of what would one day undo him, was not an army and not a prophecy but a single slender length of wood, and the ancient, half-understood laws that govern such things. So, let the slow tide carry us gently on now, away from the blindness of a whole society, and toward one of the oldest and most quietly puzzling riddles in all of magic. The riddle of wand lore, and of the eldest and most dangerous wand that ever was. Wand lore is a branch of magic so subtle that even those who spend their lives inside it speak of it with a kind of hush. Garrick Ollivander, the gentle old maker whose narrow shop has stood in Diagon Alley since long before living memory, understood it better than almost anyone, and yet even he would tell you that its deepest workings remain a mystery. A wand, in his craft, is not a simple tool. Each one is grown around a single magical core, a strand of something living and strange, and the three finest are the tail feather of a phoenix, the heartstring of a dragon, and the hair of a unicorn. Around that core is bound a wood chosen from a particular tree, and the marriage of the two gives each wand a temper, a leaning, a quiet personality all its own. And most mysterious of all, the wand is not truly bought, and it is not truly picked. In Ollivander's long experience, the wand chooses the wizard, feeling out some matching spark in the child who lifts it, so that the right one, when it is finally found, sends a warmth up the arm like a greeting between two old friends. Stranger still, a wand does not stay unchanged. It learns. It takes in the magic worked through it, the triumphs and the fears of the hand that holds it, and over the years it grows more attuned to that one wizard, the way a well-worn path grows softer underfoot. And because a wand can learn its master, it can also, under the right conditions, change its master. This is the quiet heart of the whole riddle, the thing that would tangle even the cleverest minds of the age. A wand's deepest loyalty can be won away by the one who overpowers its owner. It is a gentle mercy of the old lore that this need not be done through death. Simple defeat is enough. A wizard disarmed, his wand torn from his grip by a well-placed charm, may find that some part of that wand's allegiance has quietly slipped away to the one who bested him. Even a wand left in his hand while another he carries is captured. It is a subtle transfer, invisible, unspoken, and it turns on nothing so crude as murder, but on the older question of who has truly mastered whom. For most wands, this hidden loyalty is a small thing, a soft preference that hardly matters. But there is one wand for which it has always mattered terribly. One wand whose whole long history is written in that single law. It has been called by many names down the centuries: the Wand of Destiny, the Death Stick, and most often simply the Elder Wand, for it was carved of elder wood and strung. So the makers whispered, with a core of hair from the tail of a Thestral, one of those pale death horses we lingered with a few nights ago. It is said to be the most powerful wand ever made, able to work feats of magic beyond the reach of any ordinary one, and its story reaches back into the oldest of wizarding tales, to the eldest of three brothers, who is said to have received it from Death himself upon a lonely bridge. Whether that beginning is history, or only a bedtime story, we have already wondered together, and we need not settle it now. What is certain is that the wand was real, and that it passed, again and again, from hand to hand across the long centuries. And it passed almost always through blood. That is the shadow woven through its whole history, the reason it earned its grimmest names. Because the surest way the untutored believed they could master such a wand was to strike down the one who held it, the Elder Wand left a trail of theft and murder behind it wherever it traveled. It slipped from an eldest brother slain in his sleep to a wizard who cut his way to it. and onward through a line of dark and hungry owners, a maker of curses who set down his secrets in a wicked old book, and after him his own son, and later a wand maker who was called the Death Stick for the bodies he left, and many more besides, each master brought low in time by the next, so that the wand seemed almost to court violence, changing hands like a fever that could not be cured. It gathered a reputation as much curse as gift, a wand that would make its owner unbeatable and then, sooner or later, arrange for him to be beaten. Nearer to our own age, the wand came into the keeping of a wand maker named Grigorovich, who boasted of possessing it and tried, greedily, to unlock and copy its secrets, drawing seekers of power to his workshop. And there, one night, a bright and dangerous young man climbed in through a window, stunned the old maker, and carried the elder wand away into the dawn. That thief was Gellert Grindelwald, and with the eldest wand in his hand his power swelled until he became the most feared dark wizard the world had yet known. For years he could not be stopped. And then, at last, in the year 1945, he was met in a single legendary duel by the one wizard the wand's own logic had prepared to face him, an old friend turned adversary, Albus Dumbledore. Dumbledore won that duel, and in winning it, he won the allegiance of the Elder Wand, and he carried its terrible loyalty quietly for the rest of his long life, telling almost no one what truly lay in his hand. And here, the riddle deepens into something almost too delicate to trace, the tangle that even Voldemort could not read. For the Dark Lord, hunting the wand for himself, believed that to master it he must kill the one who wielded it, and so he set out at last for Dumbledore's tomb. But Dumbledore had already been disarmed, high on a windswept tower, by a frightened boy named Draco Malfoy, whose spell had knocked the old headmaster's wand from his grip a heartbeat before another man struck the fatal blow. In that small forgotten act the wand's loyalty had slipped, unseen, to Draco, and not to the killer at all. And later still, in the cold of a captured manor, another boy wrestled Draco's ordinary wand from his hand, and with it, without ever touching the Elder Wand itself, quietly became its true master. That boy was Harry Potter. So Voldemort, breaking open the white tomb and lifting out the fabled wand, held in his grasp a weapon that had never once belonged to him, obeying, from a great distance, a boy he had left for dead, its full power sleeping in a stranger's hand. That is the soft, unanswerable beauty of wand lore, that the mightiest wand ever made could be commanded not by the cruelest hand, but by the one who had, almost gently, been given its loyalty. Up next in Chapter 7, how Harry survived the killing curse, we'll follow that quiet mercy back through the years, all the way to a cottage in Godric's Hollow, and wonder how a single green curse could break against a sleeping child. Where the last chapter left off, among wands that choose their masters and wands that quietly refuse them, there lingered one wand whose story bent every rule of its craft, for it was a slender length of yew, 13 inches and a half, wound about a single feather drawn from the very same phoenix that had given its only other feather to a boy not yet born. And it was that wand, on the last cold night of October, in the year 1981, that spoke the two words most feared in all the wizarding world, the curse that flashes green and ends a life without wound or mark or mercy. And yet, on that night, against everything that anyone had ever known or dared to believe, the curse failed. To understand how a helpless child of 15 months came to live through the deadliest magic ever devised, one must drift back very gently to a small house in the village of Godric's Hollow and listen, softly, to what truly happened there. The Dark Lord came to that house because of a prophecy, a handful of whispered words that had named a child born as the 7th month died, a child with the power to bring about his ruin. And he had chosen to believe those words pointed to the infant son of James and Lily Potter. He came through the little garden gate in the dark, and James fell first, unarmed, buying with his last breath only the few seconds it would take his wife to climb the stairs. And there, in the small nursery beneath the sloping roof, Lily Potter placed herself between the cradle and the wand, and something happened that the killer had not expected and did not understand. For the Dark Lord, on that single occasion, offered mercy of a kind. He told the young mother to stand aside, and he told her again, and a third time, for a servant of his had begged him to spare her, and so he was willing, just this once, to let a life go free. All she needed to do was step away and let him pass to the cradle. She refused. She would not move. She would not bargain. She flung her arms wide over her son and offered her own life in the place of his, freely, with nothing forced upon her and nothing promised in return. She could have lived, and knowing that, she chose to die instead. And that choice, unremarkable as it might seem beside the great and terrible magic of the age, was itself a magic older than the war, older than the school, older than the wand in the killer's hand. When at last he turned the wand upon the child, the freely given love of that sacrifice had already woven itself into the infant like a countercharm written into his very skin, a protection the Dark Lord could neither see nor sense nor break. The killing curse leapt toward the boy and could not take hold of him. It struck him only lightly, marking his brow with a thin scar shaped like a bolt of lightning, and then it turned, and it rebounded upon the one who had cast it. In an instant, the most powerful dark wizard of the age was torn from his own body, his ruined soul ripped loose, and left as something less than the meanest ghost, a vapor, a shadow forced to flee into the night while the child cried on, alive, in the wreckage of the only home he had known. Yet the rebounding curse did more than one thing in that room, and here lies the strangest thread of the mystery. The Dark Lord's soul had already been torn many times over by his own hand, worn thin as old cloth, and when it broke apart once more in that moment of ruin, a single ragged fragment of it tore free and latched itself to the only living thing left in the nursery, to the child himself. Neither of them knew it, and neither would know it for many long years, but a piece of the murderer now lived inside the one he had failed to kill, lodged behind the scar upon his forehead. From that hidden fragment grew all the strange gifts and quiet burdens of the boy who lived, the tongue of serpents that came to him unbidden, the dreams that showed him things far away, and the thin cord of feeling that would forever bind his mind to the mind of his enemy. The wise old headmaster who found the orphan understood at once that the mother's sacrifice was a shelter too precious to waste, and so he carried the sleeping child not to a fellow wizard, but to the doorstep of an ordinary house on an ordinary street, to the home of Lily's own sister, Petunia, for in the blood the two sisters shared, the ancient protection could be renewed and sealed anew, so long as the boy could call that place his home. There, behind a charm rooted in a mother's love and a sister's shared blood, no follower of the Dark Lord could touch him, and there the shelter would hold until he came of age at 17, or until the day he could no longer name that house as home. And the proof that the protection still lived in his very flesh came years later, deep beneath the castle, when a frightened teacher named Quirinus Quirrell, hollowed out and possessed by the drifting vapor of the Dark Lord, closed his hands upon the boy to seize him, At the touch, the man's skin blistered and burned as though he had grasped a coal, for the love that had shielded a baby still lingered upon the young man's skin, and no servant of that broken soul could bear to hold him. But the tale of the surviving child does not end with a single night, for the killing curse would find him once more, and once more fail, in the deep dark of the forbidden forest at the very end of the war. To understand that second miracle, one must recall a graveyard and a cauldron, and the night the Dark Lord clawed his way back into a body of his own. Given his choice of blood to complete the dreadful rite, he chose deliberately to take it by force from Harry himself, believing that the boy's blood would at last let him touch what he could not touch before, and undo the old protection forever. And in that choosing there was a gleam of triumph in his crimson eyes, and a gleam of something else in the old headmaster's, for by drawing that blood into his own veins, the Dark Lord had unknowingly taken the mother's sacrifice into himself, and tethered the boy to life for as long as he himself should live. So when the hour came, and the boy walked without weapon or defense into the clearing among the trees, offering no resistance at all, choosing his own death to shield the friends he loved exactly as his mother had once chosen hers, the curse struck him again and again, could not simply kill him. It fell instead upon the ragged fragment of soul that had ridden inside him all those years, and it destroyed that fragment alone, freeing him of it forever. The boy lived because his enemy's own blood kept him anchored among the living, and because the wand that struck him would not truly slay the one who was, by an older and quieter rite, its rightful master. Twice then, the deadliest curse in all the world was undone, and both times by the same plain and unremarkable thing, a love that demands nothing and gives everything, passed from a mother to her son, and offered onward from the son to everyone he sought to save. Up next in Chapter 8, The Secret of the Room of Requirement, we'll wander the shifting 7th floor corridor of the castle, past the blank stretch of wall that becomes a door only for those in true need, and drift softly into the strange and hidden chamber that seemed to know, better than anyone, exactly what each weary heart had come looking for. If the last mystery lived inside a boy, this one lives inside the walls of a house, for the same castle that sheltered Harry Potter through all his growing years kept a secret of its own, older and stranger than most who walked its corridors ever guessed. Hogwarts was never simply stone and stair and portrait. It was a place that seemed, in some quiet way, to breathe, to shift, to answer. Its staircases turned of their own accord, its doorways pretended to be walls, and somewhere on the 7th floor, along an ordinary stretch of corridor that thousands passed without a second thought, there waited a room that was not always there. It came when it was needed, and it went when it was not, and to this day no one has ever fully explained what it truly was, or where its patient, obliging magic came from. To find it, a person had only to walk past a particular blank piece of wall 3 times, thinking very hard and very clearly about what they needed, and on the 3rd passing a polished door, would grow quietly out of the stone as though it had always meant to be there. The corridor that held it was easy enough to remember, for it faced a great faded tapestry showing a foolish old wizard named Barnabas the Barmy, forever trying and forever failing to teach a company of trolls the gentle art of ballet, their clubs raised in clumsy pirouettes. Across from that patient absurdity the wall would open, and beyond the new door lay precisely the room the seeker had pictured, furnished down to the smallest thing they had not even known to ask for. Some called it the come-and-go room. Most came to know it simply as the Room of Requirement, and its whole nature was folded into that second name, for it required of you first that you require it. The little house elf Dobby knew it well, and it was he who first spoke of it to Harry, having used it himself for the small sorrows of his kind. When a house elf had drunk a little too much, Dobby said, it was to that room they crept to sleep it off, and there he had once found poor Winky curled among the butterbeer, dreaming away her grief. Others had stumbled into it by pure accident across the long centuries. The caretaker Argus Filch had once discovered it brimming with cleaning things at the very moment he needed them most. And the great Albus Dumbledore himself, wandering the castle in the small gray hours before dawn, had once come upon a room he had never seen before. A room filled from wall to wall with a truly magnificent collection of chamber pots, at the exact moment such a thing would be of use to a tired old man. When he went looking for it again, of course, it had gone, as it always went, patient and unbothered, waiting for the next true need. It was Harry who put the room to its bravest use. In the year the Ministry sent a cruel and simpering woman named Dolores Umbridge to smother all real learning at the school, a small band of students met in secret to teach themselves the defensive magic they were being denied, and it was the room of requirement that gathered them in. It gave them soft cushions for falling, and shelves of the very books they needed, and along the walls it set clever silver instruments, sneakoscopes that spun at deceit, and secrecy sensors, and a great foe-glass in which the shadowy shapes of enemies drew near. There the group that called itself Dumbledore's Army grew strong and quick and sure, night after hidden night, until a single betrayal brought Umbridge and her inquisitorial squad down upon the corridor. Even then the loyal little elf gave warning, and the room, faithful to the last, tried to seal itself against the intrusion, for it seemed always to take the side of the one who needed it more. Yet the room was never wholly good or wholly kind, for it answered any need at all, and the darkest hearts could call upon it just as easily as the brightest. In the year that followed, the pale and frightened boy Draco Malfoy passed that same stretch of wall 3 times with a terrible task weighing on him, and the room gave him what he asked. He needed a place to work unseen, and so it opened onto its vastest and most crowded form. The shape it took for anyone who wished only to hide a thing away. That version was a cathedral of forgotten objects, a city of lost and hidden treasures piled higher than houses. Everything that generations of guilty and careless and secretive people had ever pushed out of sight. Somewhere in that endless maze stood a battered old vanishing cabinet, twin to another that waited far away in a shop in Nocturne Alley called Borgin and Burke's. And by mending the broken passage between the two, Draco opened a silent door through which the servants of the Dark Lord walked into the castle. The room that had shielded so many became, for one long winter, the instrument of its own undoing. And there was a deeper secret still, buried in that mountain of abandoned things, for Voldemort himself had once stood in the room of hidden things long ago, believing with all his vast and hungry pride that he alone had ever found it. He had left there something precious beyond measure to him, the lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, a slender silver crown that held within it a torn and hidden piece of his own soul. He was certain no other living person knew the room existed, and in that certainty he was entirely wrong, for the room was known to elves and caretakers and headmasters, and to a boy with green eyes who had once hidden a schoolbook there, tucking it beside a chipped stone bust that wore a dusty old wig and, atop the wig, a tarnished ancient tiara he passed by without ever knowing what it was. The room kept its rules even in its generosity. There were things it could not do, for it obeyed the same deep law that bound all magic, the old principle that food alone can never be conjured out of nothing. So when the school fell under cruel hands in its final year, and the students of Dumbledore's army fled into the room to live, it could give them swinging hammocks and warm shelter and safe walls, but it could not fill their plates. It was Neville Longbottom who led them there while the castle groaned under the rule of the Carrows, and the room, stretching wider each time another frightened child slipped through its door, at last did a thing it had perhaps never done before. It reached out and opened a passage that ran clean beyond the castle itself, down a long tunnel to a portrait of a young girl in a cluttered inn called the Hog's Head, where a gruff and grieving barman named Aberforth sent food up through the dark to keep the children fed. Even a room made of need, it seemed, could learn to be a home. Its ending, when it came, was fire. On the last and most terrible night, Harry returned to the room of hidden things to seek out the lost diadem and end the fragment of soul it carried, and in the confusion of that, search one of Draco's companions loosed a curse he could not command, the ravening cursed flame called Fiendfire. It rose in the shapes of serpents and beasts and towering birds of pure destruction, and it devoured the whole vast horde of centuries in a single roaring tide, the treasures and the rubbish and the crown alike, so that one more piece of the Dark Lord's soul was burned away by the very fire meant to guard him. The Seekers escaped the inferno on brooms snatched from the burning, but the room that had come and gone so faithfully for so long may never have come again in the same way. What it truly was, whether a spell, a spirit, or the deep old dreaming of the castle itself, no book has ever said, and that quiet not knowing is the whole of its gentle secret. Up next in Chapter 9, Why Voldemort Could Never Love, we'll drift back to a cold and loveless beginning, to a child conceived without tenderness, and a soul that could not hold the one power he most despised, and to the strange sorrow at the very root of the darkest wizard of them all. And so the castle kept its answering room, that patient hidden chamber we wandered through a moment ago, the place that becomes whatever a searching heart requires, a larder of food, a quiet refuge, a vast forgotten hall in which to hide the things one cannot bear to keep. It is a soft and comforting thought that somewhere behind a blank stretch of wall a room might rise to meet any need a person could carry to its door. Yet there was one wizard, the darkest the world had ever known, for whom the deepest need of all was not a thing that any room could conjure, because it was a thing he could not even feel. So let your breathing slow again, and let the corridors of the castle fade, and let the story drift back much further than any hidden door, back before the orphanage, back before he had chosen a name to be feared by, to a cold little house and a marriage that was built upon a lie. To understand why Lord Voldemort could never love, one must first sit for a while, gently, with the woman who bore him, for the riddle of his empty heart begins with her. Her name was Merope Gaunt, and she was the last daughter of a proud and ruined family, descendants of Salazar Slytherin himself, who lived in a squalid little hovel near the village of Little Hangleton. The Gaunts had long since spent their fortune, and kept only their pride, clinging to two treasures, a heavy gold locket that had belonged to Slytherin, and a ring set with a black stone, and to the fierce belief that their ancient blood set them above all others. Merope, though, was given none of that pride's comfort. She was downtrodden and frightened, bullied by her father Marvolo and her brother Morphin, her magic so cowed within her that it barely stirred, and she moved through that grim house like a shadow that had forgotten it once belonged to a person. But Merope loved. Across the valley, in the great house on the hill, There lived a handsome young muggle named Tom Riddle, and she watched him pass on his horse and loved him with the whole of her starved and lonely heart. When at last her father and brother were taken away to the wizard prison of Azkaban, after a violent quarrel with the law, Merope found herself, for the first time in her life, entirely alone and entirely free. And in that freedom she reached for the one thing she had never been allowed to hope for. The wise old wizard who later studied these matters, turning them over with great care, came to believe that she won Tom Riddle not by any honest means, but by a love potion, a drink slipped quietly to him, so that he would leave his own world behind and run away with her. Whether it was truly a potion or some other enchantment can never be fully known. But the kind old scholar believed, and preferred to believe, that it was a potion, brewed by a girl who wanted only to be loved in return. And here we come to the tender, terrible heart of the whole matter. For a love potion does not make love. It was known even to the students of Merope's grandson's day, taught in a warm dungeon classroom as the most powerful and most dangerous of its kind, that such a draught creates not love but a fierce and hollow obsession, a counterfeit of the real thing, an infatuation without a soul beneath it. It smells to each person of whatever they most desire, and it binds them utterly, and yet it cannot conjure the one quality it imitates. So for a strange handful of months the muggle Tom Riddle lived beside Merope, as though enchanted, which of course he was, and the two of them married, and the village whispered, and in time she found herself carrying his child. Then Merope made a choice that would echo through every year that followed, whether she had grown weary of holding a man in chains, or whether she let herself believe that he had come to love her truly by then, or that he would surely stay for the sake of their coming child, she stopped giving him the potion. And the spell fell away, and Tom Riddle woke as though from a long dream to find himself bound to a wife he had never chosen. And he left her. He went back to the great house on the hill and to his own family, and he left her alone and penniless in London, heavy with the child that would one day become the most feared wizard alive. This is the wound at the very root of the story, that the child was conceived beneath a false and forced enchantment, in a union with no true love anywhere within it. And those who came to understand him best believed that this was the reason he could never afterward feel love himself. He had been made, they thought, in a place where love was only imitated, and so the capacity for it had somehow never taken root in him. Merope, abandoned and heartbroken, seemed to lose the very will to live, and even the will to do magic. And this, too, the kind old scholar found deeply sorrowful, for she was a witch, and she might have saved herself, and she did not. Cold and destitute, she sold Slytherin's heavy gold locket, that last proud treasure of her ancestors, to a cunning shopkeeper for a mere 10 galleons, a fraction of its true worth, and he boasted of the bargain for years. And on the last evening of the year, in the bleak shelter of a muggle orphanage, she gave birth to her son, and she lived only long enough to name him. She called him Tom, for the father who had left her, and Marvolo, for the father who had tormented her, and Riddle. And she wished aloud only that he might look like his papa. And then, within the hour, she died and left him entirely alone in the world. So the boy grew up in that gray orphanage, Wool's orphanage, unheld and unrocked, with no mother's arms and no father's voice, knowing nothing of where he came from. And he grew cold in a way that frightened the good woman who ran the place, gathering small cruelties and small trophies. using the strange power he did not yet understand to hurt the other children and to keep himself apart. When the same kind old scholar came at last to bring him to the castle, he found a self-sufficient and secretive boy who wanted no friends and never had, who trusted no one and needed no one, and who was already certain that he was special and set above all others. He was, in the truest sense, a child who had never once been loved and did not know what the word could mean. And that emptiness became, in the end, the great riddle and the great flaw of his whole life. For all his cleverness and all his terrible power, he could not comprehend the one force that stood forever beyond him. He could not understand why a mother would die to shield her child, and so the oldest magic of that sacrifice burned him when he tried to touch the boy she had saved. He could not understand the loyalty of a lowly house elf, nor the fierce lie a frightened mother would tell to reach a living son, and each of these small acts of love, quietly and without fanfare, undid his grandest designs. The one whose task it was to face him was told, in the words of an old prophecy, that he would hold a power the Dark Lord knew not, and that power was never a spell or a weapon at all. It was simply this: the ability to love and to be loved, the very thing that had been withheld from a motherless boy in a cold room on the last night of a year long ago. And so the darkest wizard of the age was, at his hidden center, a small and loveless child who never learned the one magic that might have saved him. A riddle whose answer is not cruelty, but absence, laid down here softly in the dark and asked to be pitied rather than feared. Up next in Chapter 10, what became of the Marauder's map will drift after that clever, whispering parchment of moving footsteps and secret passages, and ask, gently, through how many mischievous hands it truly passed, and where all its quiet magic finally came to rest, where the last chapter lingered over a man who could never love and could never trust, who kept no true friends and left no warmth behind him anywhere in the world. This one turns very gently towards something small and worn and folded, a thing that was made out of the very opposite of all that, out of friendship and laughter and a great deal of loyal, harmless mischief. For long before it ever passed into Harry's hands, the Marauder's map was born inside the minds of 4 boys who loved one another dearly. 4 Gryffindors who spent their school years at Hogwarts between the autumn of 1971 and the summer of 1978, and who chose to sign their creation not with the plain names their families had given them, but with the secret names they had earned together in the dark. They called themselves Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. Behind those 4 odd names stood 4 very different boys. There was Remus Lupin, gentle and clever, and always a little tired, who had been bitten as a small child, and who became a werewolf on the night of every full moon. There was Peter Pettigrew, smaller and softer than the rest, anxious and eager to belong to something larger and braver than himself. There was Sirius Black, reckless and brilliant and proud, who had run from a cold, pure-blood family into the warmth of his friends. And there was James Potter, Harry's own father, the quickest and the most careless of them all, with untidy hair and a habit of ruffling it further. 3 of those 4 had done a difficult and dangerous thing entirely for the sake of the 4th, for James and Sirius and Peter had taught themselves, across long and secret years, to become animagi, to fold their human bodies down into the shape of a great stag, a huge black dog, and a small gray rat, so that on the nights when Remus turned into a wolf and could no longer safely keep his own company, his friends could slip out through the grounds and keep it for him. It was out of those wanderings, night after night, through passages and grounds and every hidden corner of an ancient castle, that the map slowly grew. The four of them came to know Hogwarts as few people ever had. Every staircase that moved, and every door that only opened if you asked it politely. Every forgotten passage that ran secretly out beyond the walls toward the little village of Hogsmeade, and they poured all of that patient, illicit knowledge into a single sheet of aged parchment. Yet the map they made was far more than a plan of stone corridors. It was a living thing. It showed, at every moment, every single person moving anywhere within the castle and its grounds, each one drawn as a tiny labeled dot that walked and paused and turned exactly as its owner did, so that the map's readers could watch the whole school breathe and shift in real time. And most wonderful of all, the map could not be fooled. It did not care what shape a person wore or what name a person claimed. It saw through cloaks and disguises and even through the strongest transformations, and it wrote beside every dot the true name of the soul that carried it, no matter how that soul had tried to hide. For a long while, though, the map did not stay in friendly hands, for at some point in those distant school years it was confiscated by Argus Filch, the caretaker, who could not read its secrets but knew mischief when he smelled it, and who locked it away in a drawer of a great cabinet in his office, a drawer marked in his own crabbed writing as holding things confiscated and highly dangerous. There it lay silent and blank for years, looking to any curious eye like nothing more than a battered scrap of old parchment, until two red-headed boys named Fred and George Weasley, mischief makers worthy of the four who came before them, stole it in their very first year and coaxed its secret out of it. To wake the map, one had to touch it with a wand and solemnly swear that one was up to no good, and only then would the ink spread across it like frost across a window, spelling out the greetings of its four makers and unfolding the whole living picture of the school. To hide it again, one had only to declare the mischief managed, and the parchment would wipe itself clean and innocent once more. The twins used it for years, and then, on a snowy Christmas in Harry's third year, they gave it to Harry himself, so that he might slip unseen down to Hogsmeade, and from that night the map became one of the quiet, faithful companions of his story. It was the map that first showed him something impossible, the small labeled dot of Peter Pettigrew, wandering the corridors long after the whole world believed Peter dead, and that single truthful mark was one of the first loose threads in the great tangle that would clear Sirius Black's name. It was the map that once betrayed to Harry the presence of Bartemius Crouch prowling where he had no business to be. And it was the map, memorably, that stood up for its makers when Severus Snape once tried to force it to reveal itself, for rather than obey him it spread across the parchment a string of mocking insults in the four boys' own words, cheeking the master who had hated them since they were children. Even blank and captured and passed from thief to thief, the thing kept the sharp, laughing loyalty of the friends who had made it. Its cleverness had only one true limit, and that limit ties this chapter softly back to an earlier one. The map could show every room the castle would admit to having, yet it could not show the room of requirement, the chamber that came and went and refused to sit still upon any plan, and so in Harry's 6th year the map failed him at the very moment he needed it most. Night after night he watched the dot named Draco Malfoy cross the castle, and then simply vanish, wink out as though the boy had stepped off the edge of the world, and no amount of staring could tell Harry where he had gone, because Draco had gone into the one room the map's makers had never been able to chart. And here we arrive at the quiet riddle that gives this chapter its name. For after those long, watchful nights, the marauder's map slips almost entirely out of the tale. It is not carried on the desperate hunt across the country that fills Harry's final year away from school. It is not found again in the hands of Snape when Snape rules the castle, nor waved during the great battle in the halls its makers once knew by heart. The book's simply close without ever telling us where it came to rest, and that silence is itself the mystery, the fate of a small enchanted thing that had seen everything and everyone, left unrecorded at the last. The only soft answer ever offered came long afterward, from the storyteller herself, who confessed that she liked to imagine the map had never truly left the family at all, that it had stayed folded in a drawer in Harry's own home, and that it had almost certainly been quietly stolen once again by a mischievous boy who carried, fittingly, the names of 2 of the 4 who first made it. Young James Sirius Potter. And so perhaps the map was never lost so much as passed on, from one generation of gentle troublemakers to the next, still swearing that its keepers were up to no good, still waiting in the dark to show a curious child every hidden door. Up next, in Chapter 11, the unanswered fate of the Dursleys will leave the warm mischief of that old parchment behind and drift toward a quieter, sadder house on a tidy street, and wonder softly what became of the ordinary family who raised a boy they never wanted and were never quite able to love. The last riddle followed a piece of enchanted parchment through corridors and secret passages, a map drawn by mischievous boys who had loved the old castle so well that some part of them never quite left it. Turn now, gently and without haste, in the other direction entirely, away from the moving stone stairways and the whispering portraits, and out into the flat gray ordinariness of a Muggle street, to a house that wanted no magic in it at all. Number 4. Privet Drive. In the town of Little Whinging, in the county of Surrey, was the tidiest and most unremarkable house on the tidiest and most unremarkable of streets, with its square lawn and its clean net curtains and its car polished to a shine each Sunday. And within its neat and careful walls there lived a family who spent long years pretending that the most extraordinary boy in all of Britain was nothing more than an ordinary and unwelcome nephew. The mystery that waits here is a soft and human one, quieter than curses and prophecies, and it is simply this. It is the question of what truly became of the Dursleys. They were 3. Vernon Dursley, large and beefy and quick to turn a deep shade of purple, who was a director at a firm called Grunnings that made drills, and who wanted from the world only that it behave exactly as he expected. Petunia Dursley, thin and blonde and long of neck, who spent a great deal of her time watching the neighbors over the garden fence, and their son Dudley, upon whom the 2 of them poured every ounce of tenderness they possessed, until the boy grew round and loud and quite certain that the whole world existed to please him. Yet the thread that ties this family to the hidden world was Petunia herself, for Petunia had been born Petunia Evans, and Lily Evans, who became Lily Potter, was her younger sister. That thin thread of shared blood, so carefully ignored inside that house, would come to matter more than any of them ever wished to understand. For Petunia had a secret, folded away and never spoken of, that softened her a little if one knew of it. She had not always scorned magic. As a girl, she had watched her clever, gentle younger sister receive a letter no one else could send, and go off each September to a castle Petunia could only imagine. And something in her had ached to follow. In her longing, she had once written a letter of her own, a careful and pleading letter to the headmaster of that school, begging to be allowed to come and learn alongside her sister. The old man had answered her kindly, as gently as he knew how, but the answer had been no, for the gift she wished for was not one she had been born with, and so the longing curdled slowly into resentment, and the resentment hardened into scorn, and Petunia learned to call the whole strange world freakish and abnormal, and married the most ordinary man she could find, and did her best to forget that she had ever wanted anything else at all. Then came the night that changed everything. The first night of November, in the year 1981, when a sleeping infant was left upon her doorstep in the small hours with a letter tucked beside him. The letter came from that same old headmaster, and it explained the terrible thing that had happened, that Lily and James Potter were dead, and that the child who slept in the blankets was all that remained of them. It also explained the strange and vital arrangement that was being asked of her, for when Lily had died to shield her son, her love and her sacrifice had sealed an ancient protection deep into the boy's very blood, a protection that could be anchored nowhere in the world except in the home of his mother's own kin. So long as Harry could call this house his home, and Petunia's blood dwelt beneath its roof beside him, no follower of the Dark Lord could reach him there. Petunia read the letter, and she took the child in. Not out of love, for there was little enough of that to spare, but out of something quieter and more binding, a promise made to a dead sister, and a duty she would never once speak aloud. The years that followed inside that house were not kind ones for the boy. He slept for a long while in the cupboard beneath the stairs, among the spiders and the dust, and wore the outgrown cast-offs of his enormous cousin, and was told 1,000 times in 1,000 small ways to be silent, to be still, to be invisible and grateful and no trouble to anyone. Only much later, and grudgingly, was he given a proper bedroom of his own. And yet, through all of it, through every cold word and locked door, the great deep magic held, year upon year. Precisely because the roof above his head was his mother's sister's roof, and the bargain struck in that first letter was quietly, faithfully kept. There came a moment when the depth of that bargain showed itself. In the summer before the boy's 5th year, after a pair of dementors drifted into a Surrey alleyway and left both boys shaken and cold, Petunia at last resolved to throw her nephew out for good. And in that very moment a howler came sailing through the window, addressed to her, and from it rose the voice of the old headmaster himself, reminding her of the last letter he had ever sent her, and of the promise she had made when she took the child beneath her roof. She went white to the lips, and she let the boy stay. In that instant it became plain that Petunia understood far more than she had ever let her husband guess, that she knew the names of the creatures in the dark and the shape of the danger circling her family, and that she had carried that knowledge silently for years. The cousin, too, was quietly changing. When the Dementors had seized upon Dudley in the alley, the great cold things had forced him to feel the very worst that lay within himself, to see himself stripped of every comfort and every excuse. Something in the boy shifted after that, slowly and without words. And so, on the gray morning near the war's end when members of the Order came to take the family into hiding, Dudley did a thing that no one who knew him could have predicted. He set a cup of tea down beside his cousin, and he said in his clumsy, halting way that he did not think Harry a waste of space after all, and he held out his heavy hand to be shaken. It was a small and awkward thawing, but it was real, and it came after a lifetime of the opposite. The leaving itself was a strange and hurried thing. For as the boy approached his 17th birthday, the old blood protection would break and fall away, and the family who had sheltered him would become, in that same instant, targets themselves, being all the bloodkin he had left. So 2 cheerful wizards of the Order, Daedalus Diggle and Hestia Jones, came to carry the Dursleys off to a safe and secret place. Vernon blustered and doubted and resisted, and at the last he agreed, and the 3 of them packed their lives into cases and prepared to abandon the tidy house forever. And at the door, Petunia paused. For one long moment it seemed she might turn and say something to the nephew she had raised so coldly, some word that had waited the better part of 18 years to be spoken. But she did not. She pressed her lips together, and she turned, and she followed her husband and her son out into the waiting dark, and the door of number 4 closed softly behind the last of them. And here is where the mystery truly lives, in the silence that follows. For the story simply never returns to them. They walk out of that door and out of the narrative altogether, and the pages that remain belong wholly to the hidden world, so that the reader is never once told where the Dursleys hid, nor whether they ever came home to Privet Drive when the danger had passed, nor whether Petunia ever spoke the words she swallowed on the doorstep. What little is known lies outside the tale itself, in quiet words spoken later, that Harry and his cousin kept a careful and distant warmth in the years to come, exchanging small kindnesses, and that Dudley grew into a father of ordinary children of his own. But Vernon and Petunia were never granted a final page. Perhaps that is the strangeness worth resting upon tonight, that the very people who fought hardest to keep all magic out of their small gray lives were, in the end, the ones the magical story could not quite bring itself to finish. Let the tidy street and the polished car and the clean net curtains grow dim and quiet now, and let that unfinished doorway fade. Up next in Chapter 12, Peeves and the spirits of the castle will, and so, with the small ordinary house on Privet Drive left dark and empty behind them, its frightened occupants swept off into a hidden life they had never asked for and would never truly understand. The slow current of our wondering turns away from that vacant place and drifts toward a building at the very opposite end of things, a building that in all its long and candlelit life is never, not for a single hour, truly empty at all. For if the home of the Dursleys stood silent because the living had gone, the castle of Hogwarts hums always with a fuller and stranger company. A whole quiet household of the departed and the not quite departed, who move through its corridors as easily as draughts move through curtains, and among them there drifts one restless presence who was never once alive to begin with. Tonight we settle gently among the spirits of the castle, and we begin with the oldest small riddle among them, the merry and maddening mystery that is Peeves. Peeves is not a ghost, though many who meet him make that mistake, and the difference lies at the very root of what he is. A ghost is the lingering imprint of a witch or a wizard who once drew breath upon the earth, and afterward chose to stay. Peeves never drew a single breath. He is a poltergeist, an indestructible spirit of pure chaos, a thing that came into being not out of a death, but out of the long crowded life of the castle itself, brewed up slowly across the centuries from mischief and high spirits, and the endless churning presence of the young. Where a great many children are gathered together for a very long time in one ancient place, laughing and quarreling and dreaming and forever breaking the rules, something of their raw, untidy energy seems to gather and to thicken. And at Hogwarts that gathering long ago took on a shape and gave itself a grinning face, and the face was Peeves. He is, in the truest sense, the naughtiness of the castle made visible, and that is the deep reason he can never be removed. For one cannot cast out the spirit of a house without first emptying the house of everyone in it. Because he was never a person, Peeves is also a good deal more solid than the gentle dead who share his halls. The house ghosts may drift harmlessly through stone and pass their pale hands through anything they touch, but Peeves can lift a suit of armor and send it crashing down a staircase, unscrew a chandelier above unwary heads, tip inkwells, jam locks with chewing gum, and pelt passing students with chalk and water bombs. He answers to almost no living soul. The old caretaker Argus Filch loathes him beyond all reason and keeps long, careful records of his crimes, and yet is powerless to be rid of him. Only the headmaster Albus Dumbledore could ever really manage him, and even that great wizard chose mostly to tolerate him, as one tolerates weather. In all his unruly reign, only one being was said to fill Peeves with genuine fear, a grim and blood-stained ghost of whom we shall speak in a moment, and only one pair of students ever truly earned his respect, a set of red-haired twins who, on the fiery afternoon they left the school forever, gave him a single parting instruction to make life difficult for a certain cruel teacher. And Peeves, who as far as anyone knew had never in his life taken an order from a child, swept off his little belled hat and bowed. And when at last the darkest night came to the castle, and its defenders stood against the Death Eaters, this same spirit of disorder threw himself into the fight on the side of the school, dropping pods and nuts and other heavy nuisances upon the heads of the invaders, so that even chaos, in the end, chose a side. Beyond Peeves move the true ghosts of Hogwarts, the pearly translucent shapes of witches and wizards who long ago decided they were not ready to go on, and chief among them are the four who belong to the four houses. For Gryffindor there is Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, known through all the school by the sadder and softer name of Nearly Headless Nick. In life he was a courtier who fell foul of the axe, and his execution was a botched and clumsy affair, blow upon blow of a blunt and poorly aimed blade that never quite finished its work, so that his head was left hanging from his neck by a single stubborn thread of skin and sinew. He died upon the 31st of October in the year 1492, and he has haunted the towers ever since, courteous and a little melancholy, forever grieved that the ghostly knights of the Headless Hunt will not admit him to their company, since his head, by that one clinging thread, is not entirely off. For Hufflepuff there drifts the fat friar, roundest and most forgiving of all the castle's dead, a jovial monk in life who is fond of good food and merry company, and of pardoning almost anyone, almost anything. The stern churchman of his day grew uneasy at his strange gifts and his cheerful ways, and put an end to him for it. And yet death seems only to have deepened his kindness, so that he glides among the Hufflepuffs, urging second chances and forgiveness upon the world. For Ravenclaw there floats a very different figure, the Grey Lady, silent and proud and beautiful, who in life was Helena, the daughter of Rowena Ravenclaw herself. Wishing to be cleverer than her famous mother, Helena stole the Great Lady's diadem and fled far away to hide it, and when her dying mother sent a certain young baron who loved her to bring her home, Helena refused him, and in a sudden rage he struck her down, and then, in horror at what his own hand had done, he turned the blade upon himself. And there, in that old grief, we meet the last of the four, the ghost of Slytherin, the Bloody Baron, who is that very same repentant lord. He glides through the dungeons covered in the silvery stains of Helena's blood, dragging heavy chains that he took up as an endless penance for the murder he can never undo. Gaunt and terrible and staring. And it is he, and he alone, of whom the fearless Peeves is truly afraid, for the poltergeist alone seems to sense the true weight of the sorrow the Baron carries. So the two women of that old story, the wronged daughter and the man who loved and killed her, drift the same castle for centuries, she keeping her secrets in the Ravenclaw Tower, and he clanking his chains below, each unable quite to leave, each unable quite to speak of it. Nor are these four the only souls the castle keeps. In a forgotten bathroom on an upper floor there weeps moaning Myrtle, a plain unhappy Ravenclaw girl who was killed in the year 1943 by an unseen horror loosed from beneath the school, and who chose to linger only so that she might haunt the schoolmate who had once teased her, and who has drifted her lonely pipes and cisterns ever since. And in a dusty classroom there drones on Professor Cuthbert Binns, the only teacher at Hogwarts who is himself a ghost, an old scholar so wedded to his lessons that he simply rose one morning from his armchair by the staff room fire and shuffled off to teach, leaving his sleeping body behind, and has taught his monotonous history to drowsy children ever since, without ever noticing that he died. All of them, the merry friar and the sorrowing lady, the nearly headless knight and the weeping girl in the pipes, have this one strange thing in common, that when the moment came, they turned back from whatever lies beyond and chose instead to stay. Yet for every soul who lingers in those halls, uncounted others slip quietly away and are never seen again, and no ghost ever returns to say where they have gone. Up next in Chapter 13, Why Some Return as Ghosts and Others Do Not, we'll follow that soft and shadowed question to its source, and wonder gently what it is that keeps a few pale souls tethered to the world, while the great and quiet many pass peacefully on. Where the last chapter left off, among the mischief of a poltergeist who had never once drawn a living breath and the drifting, pearly company of pale figures who glide unbothered through the corridors of the castle, a quieter question begins to settle over the mind like a soft gray blanket, and it is this. Of all the countless witches and wizards who have lived and loved and died across the long centuries of the magical world, why do so very few of them ever return? And why does the castle, famous the whole world over for its ghosts, hold only a scattered handful of the departed, rather than a great and silent throng? For if death were a door that swung open in both directions, the halls would be crowded past, all bearing with the pale, remembered dead. And yet they are not. And the reason lies not in a spell, and not in an accident, but in a single quiet choice made at the very threshold of dying. It was the ghost of Gryffindor Tower, Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, whom the students knew more fondly as nearly Headless Nick, who once explained this gentlest of mysteries to a grieving boy who had lately lost his godfather and wished, more than anything in the world, for the dead to come back to him. And what the pale knight offered was not a rule written in any textbook, but something far closer to a confession, spoken softly and without pride. He told the boy that at the very point of death, a witch or a wizard is granted a choice that no living person can truly imagine, and that no ghost may ever afterward take back. They may go on, passing beyond the veil into whatever lies waiting there, into that great adventure of which the wise old headmaster had always spoken so calmly and without fear. Or they may choose instead to stay, to leave behind a faint imprint of themselves upon the earth, to walk palely where their living selves once trod, lingering forever in the only world they have ever known. Very few, the knight admitted, ever choose to stay. And of those rare few who do, he counted himself among the least brave, for he confessed that he had remained behind only because he had been afraid of death, afraid of the darkness beyond, unwilling to step forward into a country from which no traveler ever sends word home. He called his long half-life a feeble imitation of the living years he had given up, and he said, without any pride at all, that he knew nothing of the true secrets of death, for he had chosen this pale shadow of living instead of walking bravely on to learn them. In that single soft admission lies the whole quiet shape of the mystery. A ghost is not a soul snatched and chained by some cruel misfortune, nor a spirit torn back into the world by the weeping of those left behind. A ghost is a soul that decided, at the very last, not to leave. And here rests one of the strangest and least noticed of the castle's truths, for only a witch or a wizard may leave such an imprint behind. No muggle, however deeply beloved, however long and tenderly remembered, may ever become a ghost, for the imprint is a thing woven of magic itself, and a soul that carries no magic simply passes gently on when the body at last gives way. This is why the ordinary world, for all its old firelit tales of haunted attics and cold and creaking stairs, holds no true ghosts at all, and why every drifting figure in the castle, without a single exception, is the lingering remnant of one who once carried a wand. Yet even among witches and wizards, the wise and the peaceful almost never choose this pale road, and so the returning dead remain rare. Those who meet the end without fear, who have made a quiet peace with their own passing, feel no pull to cling to the world, and they go on freely, and they do not look back. This is why the boy's godfather did not return to him, however fiercely the boy wished it, for that brave and reckless man had never once feared death and had faced his own ending unafraid. It is why the boy's mother and father did not linger by his cradle as pale watchers, and why the great headmaster himself, who had long called death but the next great adventure, went onward without hesitation. Their courage was, in its way, the very thing that carried them beyond all reach, for it was fear, and never love, that kept a soul earthbound. The ghosts who did remain each carried some small weight that would not let them go, and their stories, told softly, sound almost like lullabies of regret. There was the mournful girl who haunted a forgotten bathroom on an upper floor, a plain and unhappy student named Myrtle, who had hidden there in tears one afternoon and looked up straight into a pair of vast yellow eyes and died in an instant without ever knowing why. She had been so bound to her small griefs and her old resentments that she chose to stay, drifting between the pipes and the flooded tiles, unwilling even in death to surrender the world that had treated her so unkindly, and so she lingered on, weeping among the taps, for decades beyond her short and sorrowful life. There was the gray and gliding lady of Ravenclaw Tower, silent and beautiful and full of sorrow, who had once been Helena, the only daughter of the great founder Rowena Ravenclaw. In life she had stolen her mother's crowning treasure, the lost diadem, and fled far away with it out of jealousy and pride, and when a man sent to bring her home lost his temper and struck her down, she died with all her shame still fresh upon her. And it was that shame, unhealed and unconfessed, that held her to the earth, so that she chose to remain a pale and secretive ghost rather than go on and face what waited. The very man who had killed her, a proud lord of Slytherin, was so broken by grief and remorse at what he had done that he turned his own blade upon himself, and he too chose to stay, wrapped for all eternity in heavy silver chains of his own guilt. The sorrowful figure the students called the Bloody Baron, and there was the strangest lingerer of them all, an ancient teacher named Cuthbert Binns, who had grown so very old and so deeply settled into the grooves of his long routine that when he at last fell asleep one evening in his chair before the staff room fire and quietly died there, he simply rose the next morning out of habit and went to teach his lesson, leaving his own tired body behind in the chair. So thoroughly had the world of the living become a set of unthinking motions to him that he did not even notice he had crossed the threshold, and he droned on through the years as the only teacher in the whole castle who was himself a ghost. The choice to remain made so gently that it barely felt like a choice at all. Set against all of these, one figure stands as the darkest proof of the rule, for there was a wizard who feared death more desperately than any who had ever lived, and yet even he could not return as a ghost. He had torn and split his own soul so many times in his hunger to escape his ending that when at last he fell, there was nothing left whole enough to make the quiet choice that Nick had made. What remained of him could neither go bravely on nor stay behind as a pale and lingering watcher, and the boy glimpsed it once in a bright, dreamlike place that looked like a great and empty station, a small flayed and whimpering thing left shuddering beneath a bench, beyond all comfort and all help. Fear alone, it seems, is never enough to keep a soul in the world. A ghost requires a soul still whole enough to choose to stay, and his had long ago been ruined past all choosing. So the castle keeps its gentle few, each held by a small unfinished sorrow, while the brave and the peaceful pass softly onward and do not return, and the mystery resolves at last into something almost tender, a matter not of power, but of the quiet courage to let go. Up next in Chapter 14, Squibs and Magic That Skips a Soul, we'll drift softly toward those born into wizarding families who carry no magic of their own, and wonder gently at the strange thresholds that decide who wields the wand and who is quietly passed by. The last mystery lingered among those who stayed, souls that chose the long gray pause of remaining rather than the going on, an imprint of a life pressed forever into the cold air of a castle. Tonight the question turns almost gently inside out. For instead of a soul that stayed behind after a body was gone, we come to consider a body born whole and living into a house of magic in which the magic itself seemed to hang back, never arriving, never quite lighting the lamp it was expected to light. These are the Squibs, the quiet ones on the far edge of the wizarding world, and their existence is one of the softest and most unsettling riddles the old lore ever left unanswered. For no book has ever truly explained why the gift should pass a child by. To understand a Squib, it helps to hold the mirror up to something more familiar. A Muggle born is a witch or wizard of surprising origin, a child of two ordinary people, with no magic anywhere in living memory, in whom the power blooms all the same, unlooked for and undeniable. A Squib is the exact reversal of that quiet miracle. A Squib is a person born to at least one magical parent, raised among wands and moving portraits and owls at the window, and yet carrying within them no spark of magic at all. No spell they will ever cast, no charm that will ever answer their hand. They can see the whole hidden world plainly, for they belong to it by blood, and they can never take part in it. And it is that nearness without belonging that gives their story its faint and lasting ache. Even the name they carry is a small sad joke. A Squib, in the ordinary tongue, is a little firework, a slender twist of powder meant to bang and spark and dazzle. And a damp Squib is the one that never goes off, the one that lies there fizzling softly in the dark while all the others rise. So it was that the word attached itself to those children of magical families in whom the expected brightness simply failed to catch. They are said to be rare, rarer by far than Muggle-borns, and their coming into a wizarding household, especially a proud and ancient one, was very often met not with tenderness but with a kind of hushed embarrassment, a thing folded away and seldom spoken of again. Among the oldest and haughtiest families that shame could turn cruel. Upon the great dark tapestry of the House of Black, that sprawling tree stitched in gold thread across a wall of the house at number 12, Grimmauld Place, there were small scorched holes where faces should have been, each one a relative burned away for some unforgivable failing. One of those vanished names belonged to a boy called Marius Black, and his only crime, the thing that saw him blasted from the family tree and cast out of memory, was that he had been born a squib, born without the magic his bloodline demanded of him. For families like the Blacks, a child who could not do magic was a stain to be erased, and so the tapestry kept its cold, proud silence where a life had been. Yet squibs did not simply vanish from the world, and two of them walked quietly through the whole of Harry Potter's story, keeping a place for themselves along the edges where no wand was needed. The first was Argus Filch, the sour and shuffling caretaker of Hogwarts, forever mopping corridors and dreaming of hanging misbehaving students from the ceiling by their thumbs. His very name held an old watchfulness, for Argus was once a giant of 100 eyes who never fully slept, and this Argus too seemed always to be watching, prowling the castle at night with his lamp and his dust-colored cat, Mrs. Norris, who padded ahead of him and told him with a look wherever a child was breaking a rule. Filch loved that castle with a bitter, thwarted love, and he hated the young witches and wizards who filled it, and beneath the hatred lay a wound, for every child there could do, without effort, the very thing he could never do at all. It was in a careless moment in Filch's cluttered office that his secret slipped into view. Harry, waiting there in trouble one gray afternoon, glimpsed among the papers a bright envelope from something called a quickspell course, a correspondence lesson in beginner's magic aimed at grown men and women who found themselves, late and desperate, still unable to work the simplest charm. The old caretaker had signed himself up in shame and hope, and he had reached only the very first lesson, the one that patiently explained how a person ought to hold a wand. That small discovery told the whole of his tragedy in a single stroke, for a squib cannot study his way into magic any more than a person can read their way into having wings. Magic, it seems, is not a thing learned, but a thing carried, and Filch had not been given it to carry. The second of these quiet figures was a kindly old woman named Arabella Figg, who lived on Wisteria Walk near the Dursleys, and kept a house that smelled forever of cabbage and cats. To the small boy Harry she had seemed, for years, only the dreary neighbor he was dumped upon whenever his aunt and uncle wished him gone. The woman who made him look through albums of photographs of her many cats, Mr. Tibbles and Snowy, and Mr. Paws and Tufty, some of whom were not wholly cats at all, but the clever, watchful half-Kneazles she quietly bred. Only much later did the truth come clear. Arabella Figg was a squib, and she had been placed on that very street by Albus Dumbledore himself, set there like a soft sentinel to keep watch over the orphaned boy through all his ordinary years. A member of the Order of the Phoenix whose whole magic was her loyalty and her patience. Her nature came to matter on the night two Dementors drifted down a dark alley in that dull suburb and nearly claimed Harry's soul. Mrs. Figg came hurrying to the scene, and later she stood up in a cold ministry courtroom to swear she had seen the creatures with her own eyes. And here the old lore leaves a genuine puzzle glinting in the half-light, for it is held that a squib, unlike a true muggle, can dimly perceive the darkest things. feeling the sudden cold and glimpsing the shrouded shapes that no ordinary person could ever see at all. How much a squib truly sees, and how clearly, was never quite settled, and her wavering account became a small weapon in the hands of those who wished Harry harm, precisely because the exact reach of a squib's sight had never been fully mapped by anyone. For all they cannot do, squibs live within the secret, seeing the world the Muggles are charmed to overlook. Where an ordinary passerby sees only a moldering ruin hung with signs warning of danger, a squib sees the towers and torches of Hogwarts standing whole, though its doors as a student will never open to them. They dwell in a kind of gentle limbo, neither fully of the magical world that cannot quite use them, nor of the Muggle world they were never raised to join. Some slip away into ordinary lives, and it was whispered among the Weasleys that a certain second cousin of theirs was an accountant, a squib the family rarely mentioned, quietly making his way among Muggle ledgers far from the world of his birth. And beneath it all waits the deepest riddle, the one no scholar has ever answered, of why the magic skips a soul at all. No one has ever found the reason a gift so faithfully inherited should now and then simply decline to appear. Yet the old lore leaves one soft thread of consolation trailing behind it. For magic is thought never to be truly bred out of a family, only hidden and carried onward unseen. A squib might marry into the Muggle world, and their children and their children's children might live wholly without a wand, until one distant morning a child is born to that ordinary line in whom the old spark, patient across the generations, quietly lights again. So the squib and the Muggle born may be the two ends of a single long thread, the fading and the reappearing of the same deep gift, passing down through the years like a lamp handed hand to hand through a darkened house. Up next in Chapter 15, The Locked Room in the Department of Mysteries, we'll descend far below the streets of London into the strange black heart of the Ministry, past the veil that murmurs and the shelves of dusty prophecies, to the one chamber that is always kept locked, and to the ancient nameless force sleeping behind its door that the unspeakables call, quite simply, the most mysterious power of all. From the quiet riddle of magic that seems to skip a soul, passing over one child in a family and settling in another for reasons no scholar has ever fully named, the drowsy mind drifts naturally downward, deep beneath the streets of London, to a place where the wisest and most patient witches and wizards in the land have spent whole lifetimes trying to name the things that magic itself is made of. Far below the busy public floors of the Ministry of Magic, reached by a slow golden lift that sinks past level after level until it comes at last to rest at the very bottom. On the ninth and deepest of them all, there waits a cold and windowless corridor of plain black stone. At its end stands a plain black door, and behind that door begins the strangest workshop in all the wizarding world. It is called the Department of Mysteries, and those who labor there are known only as the Unspeakables, for the work they do is thought too deep and too dangerous ever to be spoken of aloud. Beyond the black door lies a round and windowless chamber, its walls unbroken save for a ring of identical handleless doors, each one black, each one shut, all of them exactly alike. When a visitor steps inside and the door swings closed behind them, the whole circular room begins slowly to turn, the walls sliding round and round until every door has changed its place and no one can any longer say by which they came in or toward which they meant to go. It is a gentle sort of trap made of confusion rather than cruelty, and it keeps the secrets of that place well. For a person may open door after door and never once find the same room twice, nor easily find their way back out again into the ordinary world above. Behind those turning doors lie the great chambers of the department, each given over to a single vast subject of study. There is a room in which brains drift like pale clouds in a deep tank of green shining liquid, thoughts made strangely solid, trailing ribbons of memory that can wrap and bind whoever calls them too close. There is a room of time, filled with a soft dancing sparkle of light, where a single crystal bell jar holds a small bird that hatches and grows and ages and dwindles back into its egg, over and over, forever, and where a tall cabinet keeps whole shelves of slender golden time-turners humming their delicate business. There is a great dim amphitheater, its stone benches descending in tiers to a sunken pit, and upon a raised dais at its heart there stands an ancient crumbling archway hung with a ragged black veil that stirs as though a breath has just passed through it, and from behind which the faint whispering of voices can almost, but never quite, be heard. And there is the towering Hall of Prophecy, row upon row of dusty little glass orbs glowing with a dim blue light, each holding the recorded murmur of a fate foretold. Yet among all those turning doors there is one that will not open, no matter who asks it. On the night that Harry Potter and his friends were drawn down into that place, fleeing through room after room in the confusion of battle, Harry came at last upon a door he could not pass. He spoke the ordinary unlocking charm at it, and nothing stirred. He drew out the small silver knife that his godfather Sirius Black had given him, a clever blade said to open any lock and undo any knot, and he pressed its point into the seam of the door, and the blade did not turn the lock at all. Instead, the silver softened and ran and melted away to useless slag in his hand, as though the door were guarded by something far older and far stronger than any craft of locksmith or knife maker. That single sealed door, alone among all the rest, is kept fastened at every hour of every day, and behind it the unspeakables keep the one force they study but can never truly master. For the unspeakables give their lives to the deepest mysteries there are. They study death, and the strange thin border between the living and whatever lies past the veil. They study time and the terrible danger of turning it. They study thought and space and the shapes of prophecy. But of all the mysteries in their keeping, one is held apart from the others, shut away behind that unopening door, because it can be watched and wondered at, but never contained, never bottled, never fully understood. It is the oldest magic and the plainest, the one every ordinary soul has felt, and yet it remains the most mysterious subject of study in the whole of that deep and secret place. Behind the locked door of the Department of Mysteries, the unspeakables keep the study of love. It was the old headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, who at the close of that dreadful year gently laid the meaning of that room before a grieving and exhausted Harry. He told him, in his soft and unhurried way, of the room in the Department of Mysteries that is kept locked at all times, and of the force it holds within, a force at once more wonderful and more terrible than death, more wonderful and more terrible than human cleverness, more wonderful and more terrible than all the wild powers of nature. It is a force that cannot be measured or weighed or reasoned into obedience, and so it is shut away, not because it is wicked, but because it is greater than the minds that would study it. And that force, Dumbledore said, was the very power that Harry himself carried in such abundance, the power that the Dark Lord had never once possessed, nor ever cared to seek. The strange and quiet strength that the old prophecy had named as the power the Dark Lord knows not. That power was love, and Dumbledore showed the boy how it had shaped his whole life without his ever knowing. It was love that had moved Harry to fly to the rescue of his godfather that very night, love that had carried him down into the department at all. It was love, long before, that had made his mother Lily step in front of the killing curse to shield her infant son, and love that had sealed an ancient protection into his very skin, a mercy so deep that the Dark Lord's touch had once burned like fire against it. And it was love, on that same night beneath the Ministry, that had saved Harry once again. For when the Dark Lord had tried to slip inside the boy's mind and wear his body like a cloak, he had found it so brimming with grief and longing and tenderness for those he had lost that he could not bear to stay, and was flung out by the sheer force of a heart too full for him to endure. In the end, it had mattered not at all that Harry could not close his mind against him. It was his heart, Dumbledore said, that had saved him. So the door remains locked, as it has always been, and as it will likely always be, holding behind it the one power that even the cleverest of the unspeakables can only stand before and marvel at, never quite grasping, never quite explaining. And perhaps that is fitting, for love was never a thing meant to be caged and catalogued and pinned to a shelf like a prophecy in a glass orb. It is felt, not learned, given, not measured. And the deepest truth of that locked and silent room is simply that the very greatest of magics is the one no scholar has ever managed to name. In all the long history of that department, no key was ever cut for that door, and none, in the end, was ever truly needed. Up next, in Chapter 16, what became of the Malfoys will drift softly toward a cold and glittering old family perched on the losing side of a war, and follow the pale, frightened thread of their fate through fear and ruin toward the quiet, uncertain mercy that waited for them at the very end. And so that locked door in the Department of Mysteries, the one we lingered beside only a moment ago, kept its quiet force sealed behind it, the power those patient researchers had judged more wonderful and more terrible than any other, the one study they could never finish and never cage. It is a soft thought to carry down into sleep that of all the mysteries the wizarding world hid away in that windowless place, the deepest and best guarded was simply love. And it feels fitting, then, that the story should drift now toward a family who seemed, for the whole long stretch of their proud history, to believe in no such thing. A family who put their faith in blood and in gold and in an ancient name, and who were saved at the very last, gently and against all their own convictions, by the one force sealed inside that room. The Malfoys were among the oldest and wealthiest of the pure blood families of Britain, and they had always meant to be so. Their fortunes were first laid down long ago by an ancestor named Armand Malfoy, who is said to have crossed the sea with William the Conqueror, and to have been rewarded with a fine parcel of land in Wiltshire for services to the new king that were spoken of only in whispers, services less than honorable. Upon that land there rose in time the great house of Malfoy Manor, a grand and shadowed place of yew hedges and white peacocks and long dim corridors, and there the family kept their treasures and their pride behind wrought iron gates. Even the name they carried seemed to hold a small warning within it, for in the old French tongue it carried the sense of bad faith, of a promise not to be trusted, and the family motto they engraved upon their crest declared that purity would always conquer in the end. That was the creed they lived by, generation upon generation, the belief that their blood set them above the rest of the world. In the years of this story, that name belonged to 3 people. There was Lucius Malfoy, cold and elegant and vain, with his long pale hair and his silver-topped cane that hid a wand within it. There was his wife, Narcissa, born a daughter of the ancient House of Black, sister to the fierce and devoted Bellatrix and to the disowned Andromeda, a woman of proud carriage and heavy-lidded disdain. And there was their only child, Draco, a boy raised to believe that the world had been arranged for his comfort, indulged and adored and taught from his cradle that his blood made him better than nearly everyone he would ever meet. They were, in the beginning, a family entirely certain of their place. Lucius had been among the followers of the Dark Lord in the First War, one of his inner circle. And yet when that first war ended and his master vanished into the mist, Lucius proved himself the cleverest kind of coward. He claimed at once that he had done his terrible deeds only under the imperious curse, that he had been bewitched against his will, and by that convenient lie he kept himself out of the wizard prison, and kept his wealth and his freedom and his influence entirely intact. He became a governor of the great school, a giver of gold to the hospital, a cultivator of ministers and politicians, a man who smiled at the powerful while keeping his old dark loyalties hidden in a drawer. For years the strategy held, and the Malfoys prospered in their manner, secure in the belief that cunning and money could purchase a family out of any storm. But the storm returned, and it did not spare them. When the Dark Lord rose again, Lucius failed him. He was sent to lead a raid upon that very department of mysteries, to seize the small glass sphere that held a prophecy, and he came away with nothing. The sphere shattered, the plan undone, and for that failure he was thrown into the fortress of Azkaban among the Dementors, stripped of his freedom and his standing all at once. And then the family learned what it truly meant to fall out of favor with such a master. As punishment for the father's failure, the son was chosen. Draco, scarcely 16 years old, was given a task designed to break him, to murder the greatest wizard of the age, an errand no boy could hope to complete and survive, laid upon him precisely because he was not expected to succeed. And when the Dark Lord walked free again in earnest, he took the manor itself for his lair, filling those proud dim corridors with his followers and his coiled serpent, so that the Malfoys became prisoners in their own grand home, humbled and frightened and stripped of every certainty they had ever owned. Through all of this, the boy who had been so cruel and so sure grew pale and hollow and afraid. When at last he stood upon the high tower with the old headmaster disarmed before him, Draco found that he could not do the thing he had been sent to do. He lowered his wand slowly in the cold night air, a child who talked of killing, but who had no killing in his heart, and it was another hand, not his. That struck the blow. And later, when the captured Harry was dragged into Malfoy Manor with his face cursed and swollen, and Draco was called upon to name him and to seal his fate, the boy hung back and would not say for certain who it was, mumbling and turning away, unwilling to be the one who condemned him. In those small hesitations one could see, very faintly, that the family's hard creed had not entirely swallowed the child. And then came the moment that turned everything, and it was made not of spells or of courage on a battlefield, but of a mother's love. In the dark of the Forbidden Forest, when the Dark Lord believed he had at last struck Harry down, it was Narcissa Malfoy he sent to kneel beside the fallen boy and confirm that he was dead. She bent low over him in the quiet, and beneath her hands she felt his heart still beating, and she understood in an instant that he lived. But she did not cry out. Instead, she brought her lips close to his ear and asked him, in a whisper too soft for any other soul to catch, whether her son was still alive within the castle walls. and the faint answer he breathed back to her told her that Draco lived. And so, for the sake of that answer alone, Narcissa rose and declared to the waiting Dark Lord and to all his followers that the boy was dead. It was a lie, the greatest and most consequential lie of the whole war, told not out of loyalty to any cause, but out of a mother's simple longing to walk into that castle and find her child. Love, and not purity, saved them all in that hour. When the last battle broke over the school, the three Malfoys did not fight. They wandered through the smoke and the falling stones, searching only for one another, caring nothing for who would win or lose. And when the fighting ended, they were found huddled together at a table in the great hall, reunited and alive, uncertain whether they had any right to be there among the victors at all. And in the reckoning that followed, they were not sent to Azkaban, for they had abandoned their master at the crucial moment, and because the boy whose life Narcissa had spared spoke on their behalf, telling of what she had done in the forest. They kept their freedom and their manor, though their old proud world of certainties lay in ruins around them. 19 quiet years later, upon the crowded platform between the barriers at the great railway station, a grown Draco could be seen with his own wife, Astoria, and their pale son, Scorpius, sending that boy off to the same school under gentler skies. Across the smoke and the noise, Draco caught sight of the man who had once been his enemy, and he gave only a small, curt nod before turning away, a cold and careful peace between them at last. And in the years after, it was told that his wife would not raise their son to hate as the old family had hated, so that something of Narcissa's saving love passed down into the next Malfoy, softening at last the ancient cruel creed that purity would always conquer. Up next in Chapter 17, the turning of time and its dangers will drift gently backward and forward at once, following the slow silver sand of the time-turners, and asking what perils wait for those who dare to unwind the hours and walk again through moments already lived. And so the last of the Malfoys settled, at length, into the strange, soft peace of those who have survived the ruin of everything they once believed, choosing at last to let the past lie where it had fallen. Yet the wish to reach backward, to unpick a single stitch of what has already been sown, is one of the oldest longings any heart can hold, and the wizarding world, for all its ancient wisdom, once kept a small golden answer to that longing hanging on a slender chain. So let your thoughts turn slowly now, the way a little hourglass turns, gently over and over upon itself, and let them drift toward the soft and perilous magic of time. The object was called a time-turner, an hourglass no larger than a locket, set within a fine ring of gold and strung upon a long, delicate chain that could be looped once, or twice, or 3 times about the neck. To turn the little glass over was to slip backward through the hours, 1 hour with every single turn, so that a witch who spun it 3 times would find herself standing in the very same place 3 hours before, in a world that had not yet caught up to all that she remembered. It was quiet magic, and precise, and it made no sound and cast no light, and to anyone who glimpsed it, it would have seemed the most harmless trinket imaginable. It came into the story in the 3rd year at the castle, in the careful keeping of the cleverest student of her age, a young witch named Hermione Granger, who had wished so fiercely to learn everything the world could teach that she had asked to study more subjects than the hours of a single day could ever hold. And so the stern and fair Professor McGonagall, with the guarded blessing of the Ministry of Magic, had arranged for the girl to carry a time-turner all through that year, and to live certain afternoons twice over, hurrying quietly back an hour so that she might sit in 2 classrooms that met at the very same time. She kept the secret close and wore the little hourglass hidden beneath her collar, and for many long months, not even her dearest friends could understand how she seemed, so impossibly, to be in 2 places at once. Then, on one particular night near the end of that year, the small golden hourglass was turned to a far graver purpose. A great and gentle wizard, the headmaster himself, spoke softly to Hermione and to Harry of the innocent creature and the innocent soul that would both be lost before the sun rose, and he gave them the smallest and strangest of instructions, that they might do some good if they were clever, and that above all else they must not be seen by any living person, least of all by themselves. And so the 2 of them turned the hourglass back 3 hours and stepped into an evening they had already lived, moving unseen across the grounds like their own patient shadows, and there they saved the noble hippogriff Buckbeak from the falling axe, and they saved the wrongly condemned Sirius Black from a fate far colder than death. And here lay one of the deepest and most soothing riddles of the whole affair, for nothing that the 2 travelers did in that recovered evening changed a single thing that had already come to pass. When Harry had first lived through that night, he had seen, across the dark and glassy lake, a bright shape drive away the swarming despair of the Dementors, and he had believed in that desperate moment that it was his own long-dead father returned to shield him. Only in the turning of time did he come to understand that the rescuer he had glimpsed was himself, that he had always been the one to cast that great silver stag, because from the very beginning it had already been done. The past could not be unwritten. It could only, gently, be completed, and every quiet step the travelers took had in truth always been folded inside that evening, waiting there all along. Yet the headmaster's warning had not been an idle one, for time is the most dangerous of all the substances a wizard may dare to touch, and the ministry guarded it more jealously than any vault of gold. Deep beneath London, in the windowless department of mysteries that we wandered through not so long ago, there lay a single cool chamber given over entirely to its study, a room where a tall crystal bell jar stood, filled with a dancing, glittering wind, and within that jar a small bird would hatch from an egg, grow, and then shrink softly back into the egg once more, over and over, forever, as time ran gently forward and then backward in an endless enchanted circle. Along the walls of that same room stood the cabinets in which every time Turner the Ministry possessed was locked carefully away. They had good reason for their secrecy and their caution, for the quiet records of their office held a warning written in real and lasting sorrow. Long before, in the year 1899, an unspeakable named Eloise Mintumble had turned a time-turner far, far past any safe and gentle hour, and had been flung all the way back into the year 1402, where she became trapped for 5 long days. When at last she was drawn home to her own time, the many centuries she had leapt across came rushing back into her body all at once, and though the healers at the hospital labored over her with all their tender skill, she had aged 500 years in the span of those 5 days, and she could not be saved. Worse still, her days spent walking in that distant age had disturbed the lives of everyone she met there, tangling the long invisible threads that ran down from them into the present, so that no fewer than 25 people living in her own century were quietly unmade, never born at all. For an anxious while it seemed a whole day might slip loose from the calendar and be lost forever. And from that grief came the settled wisdom of the office, the careful finding of the unspeakable, named Croaker, that no traveler could journey back more than about 5 hours without risking terrible and lasting harm to themselves and to the fragile weave of the world. And so it was, perhaps, a strange sort of mercy that the little golden hourglasses did not remain in the world for very much longer. On the night that Harry and his friends fought their way through the Department of Mysteries, in the year 1996, the battle spilled at last into that very room of time, and in the chaos a cabinet of time-turners was struck and sent crashing to the stone floor. The whole stock of them shattered together. And yet, being what they were, they could not simply lie broken. And so the cabinet fell and mended and fell again in an endless shivering loop, the glass forever smashing and forever made whole once more, caught in a single instant, repeating without any end. One of the dark wizards was flung into the drifting cloud of the bell jar, and his head aged and unaged as the others watched. An old man, and then a small child, and then an old man again, over and over, while the fighting raged around him. When the dust at last settled, and the wizarding world drew a careful breath, every last time-turner the Ministry had kept was gone, unmade in the very turning of the hours they had been built to command. Perhaps that was how it was always meant to end. For time is not a garden to be pruned, nor a written page to be quietly corrected, and even the wisest hands could hold it for only the smallest of moments before it slipped away between their fingers. The little hourglass could carry a clever girl through a crowded afternoon, or let two children move unseen to save two innocent lives that had always been saved. But it could never truly undo a sorrow, nor unspeak a single death, and the world seemed, in the end, quietly relieved to let it go. And that stubborn refusal of time to be mastered, that soft certainty that some things once done can never be taken back, leads gently onward to the darkest attempt any wizard ever made to cheat the thing that cannot be cheated. Not the turning of the hours this time, but the tearing of the self. Up next, in Chapter 18, How a Soul is Truly Torn, we'll follow that coldest of wizards past the turning of mere hours and down into the turning of the soul itself, and ask, softly and without fear, what a person must truly do to split their own spirit in two, and then in seven, and how so deep and unnatural a wound is ever made at all. The last riddle turned the hours themselves gently backward, a small golden hourglass spinning on a fine chain, carrying two young travelers a few careful hours into a night they had already lived, and it left behind it a soft warning that the fabric of time is a delicate and unforgiving thing, easily frayed by the lightest careless touch. Turn now, slowly and without any haste at all, away from that fragile weave of minutes and days, and towards something more intimate still, and far more terrible to disturb. For there is a fabric woven closer to us than time, threaded quietly into every living witch and wizard and muggle alike, and that fabric is the human soul. The mystery that waits here is perhaps the darkest of all the castle's hushed secrets, and it turns upon a question that most wizards never dare to speak above a whisper. It is the question of how a soul is truly torn. To understand the tearing, one must first rest a moment on the wholeness. In the old and careful lore of magic, the soul is meant to remain a single and unbroken thing, held within the living body, the way still water is held within a cup, seamless and entire from the first breath to the very last. It is not something a wizard is ever meant to reach into, nor to weigh, nor to carve into portions. And so the thing that Lord Voldemort set himself to do, across the long and hungry years of his hunt for a life without end, was a thing that ran against the deepest grain of nature, a violence turned not outward upon another, but inward, upon the very center of himself. The knowledge of how it is done came to the young Tom Riddle in a warm and lamplit office from a teacher who ought never to have spoken of it. Horace Slughorn, kindly and vain and fond of clever boys, was drawn into a conversation he would spend the rest of his life wishing away, and in that memory later recovered whole and true. The shape of the darkest art is laid gently bare. There is a name for an object in which a wizard has concealed a part of his soul, and that name is a Horcrux. The making of one begins not with any wand movement or any muttered incantation, but with the single most unnatural act a person can commit, which is murder. The taking of another life, the supreme act of evil, rips the soul apart, cleaving it clean along a wound that will never truly close. And it is that torn and severed portion, loosened from its proper place by the killing, that a wizard may then seal away inside a chosen vessel, so that even should his body be destroyed, some fragment of him remains anchored to the earth, unable to pass on and unable to die. The spell that performs the sealing, the final act that shuts the wounded scrap of soul inside its container, is one of the deepest silences in all the lore. Slughorn claimed not to know it, and if the wisest and most learned of wizards would not speak its words, then it is right that the tale should keep them hidden too. The books that circle nearest the secret circle it only at a distance. There is a volume named Magic Mosti Evil that dares to print the word Horcrux and then shrinks from it, confessing that of all wicked magic this is the wickedest, and refusing to say more. There is a darker book still, kept for a time within the very walls of the school, before a cautious headmaster carried it away to his private shelves, a book called Secrets of the Darkest Art. And it is there that the smallest and most dreadful details lie, the warnings and the cautions that no gentle library should ever have held. The lore reaches back far beyond Voldemort, back into the dim beginnings of recorded magic, to a Greek wizard of ancient days named Herpo the Foul. He was the first, so the histories murmur, to work this particular horror, the first ever to tear his own soul and lock a piece of it away, and for a very long age he stood almost alone in it. So rare and so repellent was the deed that even the darkest of wizards turned from it in something close to fear. That so few ever attempted it says much. It is not the difficulty that stayed their hands, but the cost, for the price is paid in the self. And there are things a person cannot do to their own soul and afterward remain wholly a person at all. For here is the quiet cruelty at the heart of it. Each tearing leaves the soul more fragile than before, more unstable, more prone to slipping and to breaking further, and each act of murder committed for the sake of another Horcrux does its damage not only to the victim, but to the murderer, wearing the human shape of him thinner and thinner. This is why the boy who had once been handsome, dark-eyed, and clever, and outwardly ordinary, grew across the years into something scarcely human to look upon, his features flattened, his eyes reddened, his nose worn down to slits like a serpent's, his skin gone pale as bone. The face was the map of the ruin within. A soul divided so many times could not help but show, at last, upon the body it had abandoned in pieces. And Voldemort divided his soul further than any wizard in all the long record of the world. Where Herpo the Foul had made a single Horcrux, and where the darkest of others had shrunk from even one, Voldemort resolved upon a number he believed to be the most powerfully magical of all, the number 7. He would rend his soul into 7 parts, 1 to remain within his living body, and 6 to be sealed away in the world, hidden in objects of great meaning to him. Into a plain black diary went the first, born of the killing of a girl in a school bathroom long ago. Into a heavy gold ring set with a dark stone went another, purchased with the murder of the Muggle father who had abandoned him. A locket that had once belonged to Salazar Slytherin, a small golden cup that had once been Helga Hufflepuff's, a lost and lovely diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw's, and at the last the great snake that coiled always at his side. Each of these he filled with a torn shred of himself, purchased each time with a life. 6 Horcruxes, and a 7th piece kept in his own breast, a soul in tatters spread across the length and breadth of Britain. There was one more splitting he never intended, and it is the strangest of all. On the night his curse turned back upon him, and his body was torn away, the last frail sliver of soul still clinging to him was flung loose, and having nowhere else to go, it fastened itself to the only living thing in that ruined nursery, to the infant lying in the cot. So the boy became, without knowing it, the final vessel, a living Horcrux carrying a fragment of the very enemy who had come to end him. And because these anchors held him fast to the world, Voldemort could not truly die even then. He survived as something less than a ghost, less than the meanest spirit, a shred of a shredded soul drifting in exile, waiting. The gentlest truth in all this darkness is that the wound can, in theory, be healed, though almost no one who tears a soul ever pays the price of mending it. The only known remedy is remorse, real and whole and piercing, a grief so genuine at the evil one has done that it can knit the torn soul back together. Yet that same remorse is said to be so agonizing in the doing that it can consume the one who feels it utterly. And that road, the road back toward wholeness, was one that Voldemort, to the very end, would never once consent to walk. Let the torn soul and its scattered hiding places grow dim and quiet now, and let the horror of the deed fade softly into rest. Up next in Chapter 19, The Fate of Nagini the Maledictus, Will. The last riddle gazed into the darkest craft that any wizard ever dared to practice, the deliberate tearing of a soul by the act of murder, and the hiding of each torn fragment inside some chosen vessel, so that death itself might be cheated of its due. Turn now, gently, and without alarm, away from the cups and the lockets and the cold enchanted rings of that grim collection, and rest instead upon the strangest vessel the Dark Lord ever chose, for it was not a thing of gold or glass or graven silver at all, but a living creature with a heartbeat of its own. It was the great serpent named Nagini, who coiled at Voldemort's side through all his final years, whom he loved as near to loving as his ruined heart could manage, and whose story reaches back much further and much sadder than nearly anyone who feared her ever knew. For long before she was a weapon, and long before she was a Horcrux, Nagini had been a woman. This is the softest and most sorrowful secret in all her tale, and it was told only decades after her death. In the wider story of the wizarding world before Harry was ever born. Nagini had been born under a rare and cruel affliction called a maledictus, a blood curse carried only by women and passed down without mercy from mother to daughter across the generations. Those who bore it were doomed to a slow and irreversible fate, for as the years went by the curse would rise within them, and each transformation into an animal form would last a little longer and hold a little tighter, until one day the change would become permanent and the woman would be lost forever inside the body of the beast, never to walk in human shape again. For Nagini the beast was a serpent, and so her name was drawn from the Naga, the great serpent spirits of old story, and her fate was to become, at the last, the very snake whose name she carried. In her younger days, before the curse had closed its fist entirely, she was still able to pass between her two forms, and she lived, if it could be called living, as an attraction in a traveling show of magical curiosities known as the Circus Arcanus, in the city of Paris in the years between the wars. There, night after night, she was displayed before gawking crowds as an underbeast, made to change from woman to serpent for the amusement of strangers who saw in her nothing but a spectacle, while her cruel master profited from the wonder and the pity in the room. It was a small and friendless existence, cold and bright and lonely, and in it she found only one true companion, a troubled and gentle young man named Credence, who was as lost and as unwanted as she was herself. Together the two of them slipped away from the circus and its chains, two frightened souls seeking some place in the world that might hold them kindly, and for a brief while they had one another, which was more than either had known before. Yet the curse in her blood knew nothing of hope, and it did not relent. Slowly, across the long years that followed, the serpent claimed more and more of her, until at the last the woman was gone entirely, and only the great snake remained, wordless and cold, her human self buried so deep that no light could reach it. And it was in this final and permanent shape, stripped of every memory of the girl she had been, that her path crossed the darkest of all wizards. How exactly the fallen Lord Voldemort came to possess her is not written plainly, but come to possess her he did, and he made of her a familiar closer to him than any human follower, so that the two moved through the world as one shadow, the wandless master and his enormous, patient snake. She served him first as his very lifeline. In the long years of his ruin, after the curse that had rebounded upon him left him less than a ghost and barely more than a breath, it was Nagini's venom, milked from her and mixed into a dark and dreadful potion, that gave his rudimentary body the strength to cling to the edge of existence and to plot his return. And when he chose to guard his shattered self against death with one final splinter of his soul, it was into Nagini that he poured it, making of her the last Horcrux he would ever craft, and the only one that lived and breathed and could move of its own accord. The wise old headmaster of Hogwarts came to suspect this in time, reasoning that Voldemort must have used a murder to seal the fragment into her. Perhaps the killing of an old Muggle gardener at the Riddle House, though even the wisest could never be wholly certain of the moment. What was certain was the peril of it, for a Horcrux that could slither and strike, and think was a far more dangerous thing to hunt than a cup left cold in a vault. And strike she did, again and again, through the years of the Gathering War. It was Nagini who was set upon that same old Muggle caretaker when he stumbled by night upon a plotting in the dark. It was Nagini who was sent, in the deep of one terrible night, to fall upon the sleeping guard of a certain door in the Ministry of Magic, sinking her fangs into the good and gentle father of the Weasley family and very nearly ending him, so that his life hung by a thread of stitches and old magic for many long days. It was Nagini, most eerily of all, who was hidden inside the lifeless body of a poor old historian in the village of Godric's Hollow, made to wear the shape of a kindly woman as a lure, and who burst forth from that ruined disguise to very nearly trap the boy she had been sent to snare. And it was Nagini, at the war's near ending, whom her master loosed inside a dusty shack against the one man who had served two masters in secret, so that the great snake took the life of Severus Snape while Voldemort watched, believing wrongly that the wand of the Elder Yew would answer to him once the deed was done. By then the Dark Lord had grown afraid for her, in a way he was afraid for nothing else, for he had felt his other Horcruxes destroyed one by one, like small deaths sounding far away, and he understood at last that his enemies knew his secret. And so he drew Nagini close and wrapped her in a shimmering enchanted sphere of protection, a cage of light that floated at his shoulder. And he would not let her stray beyond his reach. She had become the last of him that remained outside his own body, the final knot that tied his torn soul to the living world, and he guarded her as a miser guards the one coin he has left. Which is why her ending, when it came, undid so much at a single stroke. On the broken ground before the castle, in the last hour of the last battle, it was a quiet and once timid boy who had grown at last into his courage, Neville Longbottom, who drew the gleaming sword of Gryffindor from the depths of the old sorting hat, and who swung it in one clean and shining arc, and struck the head of the great serpent from her body. In that instant the final Horcrux was destroyed. The last shard of the Dark Lord's hidden soul burned away, and Voldemort stood truly mortal for the first time in half a century, though he did not yet know it. And somewhere far beneath the cold and ancient scales, if any faint ember of the lonely circus girl still lingered, perhaps that blow was not only an ending, but a release. A curse at last broken, a long imprisonment, finally, mercifully closed. Let the great coils fall still now, and the shimmering cage go dark, and let the woman who was lost inside the snake rest quiet at the end of her long unwinding. Up next in Chapter 20, the last quiet questions will. The serpent who had once been a woman has coiled away now into the dark behind us, and with her passes the last of the great riddles, the ones large enough to fill a chapter of their own and to cast a long shadow across a whole life. Yet the world of magic does not tidy itself so neatly as that, and there remain, scattered like small pale stones along the shore of the story, a handful of quieter questions, ones too soft and too slight ever to have demanded an answer, and which, for that very reason, have never truly received one. These are the last quiet questions, and tonight we gather them gently, not to solve them, for some of them can never be solved, but only to hold them for a moment in the warm hush before sleep, and then to set them softly down again. There is, first, the question of what an old man saw in a mirror. In the earliest days of Harry's schooling, when he was small and newly motherless and wandering the castle by night, he had stumbled upon a tall mirror in a disused room, its frame carved with words that ran backward, promising to show not the face before it, but the deepest longing of the heart that looked in. In its glass, Harry had seen his mother and his father standing behind him, smiling, alive, and when at last the headmaster found him there and drew him gently away, Harry had asked what the old wizard himself beheld when he stood before that glass. Dumbledore had answered, lightly and kindly, that he saw himself holding a thick pair of woolen socks, for one could never, he said, have enough of them. Harry sensed even then that this was not quite the truth, and he was right, for it has since been told that the man who claimed to wish only for socks longed in truth for a thing he could never have, for his mother and his father living still, for his gentle sister Ariana, whole and unharmed, and for the brother who no longer forgave him standing once more at his side. That was the desire the mirror would have shown him, and knowing it, he had turned away, and he had warned Harry never to go seeking there again, for it did not do to dwell upon dreams and forget to live. There is, next, the question of the voices behind the veil. Deep beneath the streets of London, in the Department of Mysteries, there lies a great sunken chamber, dim and cold, with tiers of stone benches descending like an amphitheater toward a low dais at its center. Upon that dais stands an ancient archway of crumbling stone, and hung within the arch is a ragged black curtain, a veil that sways and flutters softly, as though a breeze were stirring it, though the air of that deep room never moves at all. When Harry first stood before it, he felt certain he could hear something, a faint murmuring, a whispering of many voices just on the far side of the cloth, as though a crowd of people stood there, speaking low, hidden from sight. Luna Lovegood heard them too, and said, in her calm and unbothered way, that there were people there, waiting, just out of view. Harry felt himself drawn toward the arch, wishing to climb the dais and lift the veil and look, and it took the voices of his friends to call him back. It was through that same archway that his godfather Sirius would later fall, struck by a curse, vanishing behind the fluttering curtain and never returning. What lies beyond it, whether it is the doorway of death itself, and whose the whispering voices are, no unspeakable has ever explained, and perhaps none ever will. There is, too, the smaller and stranger question of a wand that acted alone. On the night the Order of the Phoenix spirited Harry away from the house on Privet Drive, 7 of them disguised as him and scattered into the dark sky, the Dark Lord himself came flying after the true boy through the rushing night air. And in that moment, as Voldemort bore down upon him, Harry's wand, the wand of holly with its single feather from a phoenix, moved in his hand of its own accord. He did not choose the spell, nor raise his arm to cast it. The wand turned itself toward the pursuing enemy and loosed a jet of golden fire, and it shattered the borrowed wand that the Dark Lord carried, so that he tumbled away, thwarted and astonished. Long afterward, still troubled by it, Harry sought out the great wand-maker Ollivander and asked him to explain what had happened, and even that old master of wand lore, who had studied their secrets across a long lifetime, could not say for certain why the wand had done what it did. Some connection, some deep recognition between twin cores and ancient enemies seemed to have stirred the holly wand to act without its master's will. But the whole of it was never fully understood, and it remains one of the softest and least explained wonders in all the story. A wand that knew, somehow, a little more than the hand that held it. Not every quiet question, it should be said, went forever without its answer. There was, for a time, the small, sad mystery of a bright blue eye. Sirius had once given his godson a little handled mirror, one of a matched pair, by which 2 friends might speak to one another across a distance, and Harry, sunk in his grief, had let it lie forgotten, and then broken at the bottom of his trunk. Yet in his darkest hour, held prisoner in the cellar of a cold and cruel house, Harry glimpsed in a jagged shard of that very glass a single bright blue eye watching him, and his heart leapt, for he thought, wildly, that it might be Dumbledore returned to him. It was not. It was the eye of Aberforth, the headmaster's estranged brother, keeping his own quiet watch over the boy from far away, and it was he who sent the little elf Dobby to pull them out of that dungeon and into the night. So that riddle, at least, was gently answered, though its answer arrived wrapped in loss. But others were not answered, and were never going to be. And there is, at the very last, the gentlest question of all, the one that asks whether a certain quiet place was real. When Harry walked at length into the forest to meet his death, and the killing curse struck him a second time, he did not wake in any world he knew. He found himself instead in a vast, bright, misty place, clean and white and still, that seemed, as it slowly formed around him, to take the shape of a great railway station, the very station from which he had first ridden away to school as a boy. There Dumbledore met him once more, calm and whole and kind, and they lingered a long while together, speaking of all that had passed and all that still remained to be done. And when Harry asked whether this strange bright place was truly real, or whether it was only something happening inside his own head, the old headmaster smiled and answered that of course it was happening inside his head, and then wondered aloud, gently, why on earth that should mean it was not real. It is a question with no floor beneath it, one that opens softly and never closes again, and it was left, as such questions must be, exactly where it lay, shimmering and unanswered, in the pale light of that silent station. So these are the last of them, the quiet questions, the ones that were never meant to be caught and pinned and solved, but only wondered at, and then, in time, let go. What an old man saw in a mirror. What whispers behind a swaying veil. Why a wand once moved on its own. Whether a bright and misty station was real. They do not clamor to be answered, these small soft riddles, and it is right that they should not. For in the end, the story closes not upon an answer but upon a stillness. It closes upon a boy grown into a man, standing on a sunlit platform many years later, watching his own children ride away to school. His scar had not pained him for a very long while, for 19 slow and peaceful years, and it troubled him no more. All was well. And here, gathered together at the last, every question we have turned over in the long dark hours behind us grows soft, and slows, and settles, sinking away like a stone through still water, until there is nothing left that must be answered, and nothing at all that needs to be solved, and only the quiet remains. And so we come, softly to the end of the story. Tonight we turned over one quiet riddle after another. Why a trusted man was trusted, the sad short life of Ariana, the unseen creatures that pull the carriages, the fairy tale that was also a true history, and how a whole world failed to see a dark lord return. We wondered at the roaming allegiance of the eldest wand, at how a boy survived a curse that should have ended him, at the room that becomes whatever is needed, and at why one man could never love. We followed a lost map, the fate of the family that raised him, the spirits that stay and the spirits that go, the magic that skips a soul, a locked room full of something older than any spell, the long twilight of the Malfoys, the danger of turning time, the darkest way a soul is torn, the serpent who was once a woman, and the last quiet questions that have no answer at all. There is nothing left now that you must solve. Let each of those old questions sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here needs answering tonight, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us, and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales waiting for the nights ahead.